dragging sand and snow in its teeth. Luda braced her shoulders against the canvas flap of the tent. Her hands, raw and cracked from cold, gripped the wooden pole so tight her knuckles turned pale beneath the bronze of her skin. The hide shelter quivered like an animal ready to bolt. Inside, 3 children huddled around a dying ember. The oldest, Emma, pressed her arms around her brother Samuel, while the youngest, little Grace, coughed in small, shallow bursts. The sound sliced through Luda harder than the wind. "Hold the blanket tight," she told them, her voice steady but thin. The flames sputtered. Smoke curled up, gray and desperate. Luda dropped to her knees and blew gently, trying to coax life back into it. The air tasted of ash and dust. Her lips were split, her breath shallow from the thin cold. Outside, the storm screamed. Canvas tore. One corner of the tent peeled loose and snapped like a whip. Luda crawled out into the gale, hair whipping against her face, and fought to tie it down. The rope burned her palms. She could barely see the ridge. The horizon had vanished behind a wall of dust and snow. Somewhere beyond that blur lay the graves of her people, the lands the soldiers had taken, the rivers now fenced off by men who called themselves settlers. Her husband Tahana had believed they could find peace north of the border, maybe even a patch of land no one wanted. But fever had taken him before the first thaw. Luda still heard his voice sometimes, gentle, patient, even at the end. "If you hear the eagle in the wind," he had said, his hand trembling against her cheek, "that will be me, showing you the way." Now the wind roared so loud it sounded like wings. She pressed her forehead against the frozen ground. "Then guide me, Tahana," she whispered, "because I don't know where to go anymore." When she crawled back inside, Emma was crying silently. Samuel stared at the canvas walls as if his will alone could hold them together. Grace lay half-conscious, her skin hot and damp. Luda tore strips from her shawl, wet them with the last of their melted snow, and pressed them to the child's forehead. The storm clawed harder, tearing open another seam. Dust stung her eyes. Her mind flickered to the rifle leaning against the corner. One bullet left. She had thought about using it on coyotes. Tonight she wondered if it would be kinder to use it on herself if the tent gave way. Then above the wind came a different sound, metal clanging, hooves striking frozen earth. At first she thought she was dreaming. No one rode out in weather like this. But the light grew brighter, flickering orange against the torn canvas. She shoved the flap aside. A man on horseback emerged from the curtain of dust, lantern held high. The horse, a gray mare coated in frost, fought the gusts but kept its footing. The rider's hat brim was white with ice. "Ma'am," he shouted, "you can't stay out here." Luda's hand went to the rifle. "Keep your distance." He pulled the horse up short, raising his free hand. "Name's Rowan Tate. I own the ranch half a mile west. Your tent's about to fly clear to the Dakotas. There's a cabin you can use." The words barely reached her through the wind. "We're fine," she shouted back, though the lie froze in her throat. The man leaned forward in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "You'll be dead before morning. I've seen storms take whole wagons. Let me help." Luda hesitated. The last time a white man had offered help, her brother hadn't come back. Lightning flared across the horizon, throwing everything into stark relief. The wild hair across her face, the 3 small shapes behind her, the horse's flared nostrils. In that flash, she saw not threat, but resolve in the stranger's expression. Then thunder hit, close enough to rattle her ribs. The tent pole snapped in half. Canvas collapsed around her like a suffocating shroud. Rowan swung down before she could react, his boots sinking into the mud. "Get the children!" he yelled. "Now!" She froze a second longer, then scooped Grace into her arms. Samuel grabbed the rifle. Emma clutched her mother's skirt. Rowan pulled the canvas aside and shoved them toward the mare. "Up!" he ordered, lifting Emma first, then Samuel. He reached for Grace, and for a heartbeat, Luda almost refused. But the child's weight grew limp in her arms. She let him take her. The mare shifted beneath the burden of 4 bodies. Rowan climbed up behind, wrapping one arm around the group, the other gripping the reins. "Hang on," he said, voice rough but certain. "The cabin's east of the creek. 10 minutes if the wind doesn't eat us." They plunged into the storm. The world vanished into white. The mare stumbled, caught herself, kept running. Luda buried Grace's face against her chest to shield her from the hail. Each breath burned. The cold sliced through her dress, through skin, through the bone of her grief. Yet beneath the roar, she could hear something else. The rhythmic pounding of hooves, steady as a heartbeat. They reached a line of cottonwoods, the branches whipping like black snakes. Through them, faint and small, a square of light pulsed, a door half open, fire within. Rowan steered the mare straight for it. He jumped down, pulled open the cabin door, and motioned them inside. The place smelled of dust, hay, and old smoke. A single stove glowed red. Luda stepped over the threshold, her boots sinking into dry earth instead of mud for the first time in months. Rowan set Grace on a cot, tossed 2 logs into the stove, and shut the iron latch. The wind banged against the walls, but the roof held. For a long time, no one spoke. The children watched the fire as if it might vanish. Luda stood near the door, hands still trembling on the rifle. Rowan turned, sweat freezing on his brow. "There's blankets in the trunk, water barrel in the corner. Stay here tonight." "Why?" she asked, the question cutting sharper than she meant. He looked at her as though the answer was obvious. "Because nobody should die just because they ran out of luck." She studied him in the flicker of the fire. Lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged but didn't break. He moved toward the door. "I'll be back after I see to the stock." Before she could stop herself, she said, "The storm will kill you." He gave a half smile, the kind born from too many winters. "Ma'am, this storm's still got a long ride before it catches me." Then he was gone, swallowed by the wind again. Luda sank to the floor beside the cot. The warmth from the stove crawled into her bones, heavy and unfamiliar. She watched the flames twist and dance. For months she had prayed to the spirits of her ancestors, and they had been silent. Now a stranger had come riding through the storm carrying fire in his hands. Outside, the wind wailed like a chorus of lost souls. Inside, for the first time since Tahana's death, Luda let her eyes close. "Maybe," she whispered, "the eagle was real after all." The door slammed behind them, and the wind screamed dulled to a hoarse murmur. For the first time that night, silence had a weight. It pressed down heavy, like the snow stacking on the roof. Rowan set his lantern on the rough-hewn table, its flame flickering against the log walls. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in lazy circles above the stove that still held a ghost of warmth from whoever last used it. He moved without hurry, like a man used to weathering chaos. One motion had him kicking snow from his boots, the next peeling off his long coat and wrapping it around the smallest child. Grace stirred weakly, her lashes clumped with frost. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Luda stood near the door, one hand still on the handle, the other hovering near the knife strapped at her hip. She didn't answer. Her eyes followed him the way a wolf tracks a trespasser, measuring, silent, ready. Rowan didn't seem to notice the blade. He busied himself stacking kindling into the stove, striking a match with practiced ease. Sparks flared, caught, and grew into flame. Light filled the room, soft gold licking across the floorboards, across the curve of Luda's cheek, the braids dark against her skin. The cabin smelled of cedar, old smoke, and the faint sweetness of horse feed stored in the corner. When the fire finally took hold, Rowan leaned back on his heels, breathing hard. "That'll do," he said quietly, voice roughened by wind and dust. "You can set the children by the stove." Emma guided her brother and sister closer to the heat. Steam rose from their clothes as snow melted off. Samuel's lips trembled, not from cold this time, but from the shock of safety. Luda stayed by the wall, the rifle slung over one shoulder, watching the stranger move about as if he belonged here. Rowan poured water from a barrel into a dented pot, set it to warm on the stove. Then he turned to her, meeting her stare squarely. "I don't mean to frighten you," he said. "This cabin's mine. Used it for the hands during roundup season, but it's empty now. You can stay the night." Her voice came low, wary. "Why?" "Because leaving you out there would have been murder." "I didn't ask you to save us." He nodded once. "Maybe not, but I couldn't let 4 souls freeze on my land. I don't do charity, ma'am. Just right and wrong." She flinched slightly at the word ma'am. It felt strange being addressed with respect by a man like him. Most white men didn't bother to look her in the eye. The fire grew stronger. Shadows danced along the logs, painting his face in gold and black. He was broad-shouldered, beard lined with frost, eyes tired but clear, like someone who had seen too much and carried it quietly. He filled a tin cup and handed it toward her. Drink, melted snow, nothing fancy. Ah. She hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing his for the briefest instant. Her hand was small, rough from work and cold. His touch was warm, steady. Luda drank, the water tasting of metal and smoke, but it eased the tightness in her throat. Your children'll need rest, Rowan said. I'll check the horses, then come back. She lowered the cup, eyes narrowing. You risk your life for strangers, then walk back into the storm? He half smiled. Been risking it every day since I bought this place. Storm's the least of my worries. He reached for his hat, paused. There's jerky in the tin near the stove. Feed them. I'll be back soon. Luda waited until the door shut behind him. Then she exhaled, a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The knife stayed close, but her attention shifted to the children. She tore strips of jerky, shared it out evenly. The sound of chewing filled the room. Small, fragile proof they were alive. She set her palms near the heat. For months, fire had been an enemy, smoke giving away their camp, ash marking another loss. Tonight, its glow felt different. It pulsed softly, steady and alive, warming more than her hands. The storm outside raged on, but the one inside her began to fade. Minutes passed, maybe hours. When the door opened again, a blast of wind swept in, and Rowan stepped through covered in snow to his shoulders. He shook it off, stamped his boots. Horses are fine, he said. Cabin'll hold. He crouched beside the stove, rubbing his hands near the flame. Wasn't expecting company tonight. Luda studied him. Then why were you out there? Checking fences, he said simply. Couldn't sleep. Figured the storm might take one down. You found us instead. Guess so. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not defiance, but exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Where were you headed? She stared at the fire. North, toward the river. My husband said there were valleys up there, land we could plant on, but she stopped. The words refused to come. Rowan didn't press. He didn't make it. She nodded once. I'm sorry. Her eyes lifted to meet his. People like you don't say sorry to people like me. I ain't people like me, he said quietly. Not anymore. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind moaned through the chinks in the wall, a long, mournful song. Inside, the fire popped, steady as a heartbeat. Rowan leaned back against the table leg. For what it's worth, I'm not here to pity you. I just can't stand the thought of anyone dying on my land. Not woman, not child, not Apache or white. Her mouth tightened. Men who came before you said the same, and then took everything we had. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just stared into the fire and said, maybe it's time someone meant it. The words hung there, heavier than the wind. For the first time since he'd arrived, Luda felt something shift. The hardness in her chest cracked a little. The heat from the stove brushed her cheeks, soft and alive. She lowered herself to the floor near the children, still keeping a few feet between them. Grace slept, face pink now instead of blue. Samuel leaned against his sister's shoulder. Luda looked at Rowan, who sat by the fire, eyes half closed. He wasn't handsome in the polished way of townsmen, but there was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that didn't demand trust but earned it by existing. The flames reflected in his eyes. For a moment she thought she saw Tahana there too, his spirit flickering between light and shadow, watching, approving. She whispered under her breath in Apache, a prayer half spoken, half felt. For those who walk with kindness, may the wind spare their path. Rowan must have sensed it, though he couldn't understand the words. What did you say? Just thanking the wind for stopping. He smiled faintly. Seems like it listened. They both turned toward the window. Outside, the storm was losing its teeth. The howling eased into a low hum, like a tired beast settling to rest. Inside, the fire burned brighter, casting long shapes on the walls. Two strangers, two worlds, bound for a single night by mercy and stormlight. Luda's fingers loosened on the knife. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel hunted. The morning came pale and brittle, a sky washed clean by wind and ice. Frost glazed the windows of the old cabin. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Luda woke to the crackle of dying embers and the slow rhythm of her own breathing. For a moment she forgot where she was, the scent of smoke, the shape of the rafters above her. It all felt foreign, too safe, too still. Then Grace stirred against her arm, warm and breathing softly, and memory returned. The stranger, the storm, the fire. She sat up, brushing hair from her eyes. The children still slept in a tangle of borrowed blankets. Outside, she could hear the creak of saddle leather and the faint, low sound of a horse snorting steam into the cold air. Luda reached for her knife before she reached for her shoes. Old habits died hard. When the door opened, the light made her squint. Rowan Tate stepped in, boots wet with snow, carrying a burlap sack slung over one shoulder. His face was red from wind, but his expression was calm, like the weather had no say over his mood. He set the sack on the table and began unpacking it. Bread, a tin of beans, jerky, a folded blanket, a jug of water. Then from the small leather pouch at his belt, he drew something wrapped in cloth. "I found this," he said quietly. Luda didn't move. Her eyes narrowed as he unwrapped it, slowly with care. Inside lay a small carving, darkened by soot, a wooden eagle, wings outstretched, its beak sharp and proud. He held it toward her. "It was buried in the ashes near your tent. Figured it might mean something." For a long heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. The room fell away. She saw Tahana again, his hands shaping that same piece of cedar by the campfire, laughing as wood chips flew. He had told her it would keep their family safe. Now, blackened and cracked, it looked like it had flown through fire itself. Her fingers trembled as she took it. "This was his," she whispered. "He carved it before he died." Rowan nodded, silent. Luda's eyes burned, but no tears came. Her people didn't cry where others could see. Grief was a private storm. She clenched the charm tight until the sharp edge of its wing bit her palm. "Thank you," she said at last, the words rough and foreign on her tongue. Rowan gave a small shrug. "Didn't seem right, leaving it there." He turned away to tend the fire, giving her space. The crackle filled the room again, louder now, alive. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Why help us?" He tossed a log into the flames, sparks leaping like fireflies. "Because you needed it." "That's not an answer," she said. Rowan leaned an elbow on his knee, eyes on the coals. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Lost her too soon. Since then, I can't stand seeing anybody left out in the cold." Luda's gaze hardened again. "We've learned not to trust men who come out of the storm saying kind things." "I'm not asking you to trust me," he replied. "Just take the food and the blanket, that's all." The fire snapped between them like a warning line. Inside her chest, two feelings wrestled, gratitude and fear. In her world, one always followed the other. The Apache believed that accepting help meant accepting a bond, a thread that could tighten and choke if pulled by the wrong hands. Her husband had died believing in mercy once. It had cost him his life. She looked at Rowan's face in the firelight, tired, scarred, human. No malice there, just the quiet weight of a man carrying ghosts of his own. Still, she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Later that morning, the children stirred. Emma rubbed her eyes and whispered, "Mama, where are we?" "In a place with walls," Luda said softly. "For now." Rowan stepped outside to fetch wood. The door shut and his footsteps faded. Luda sat by the sleeping child, tracing the eagle carving with her thumb. The wood was smooth where the flames hadn't touched, rough where they had, like her own heart, scarred but still holding its shape. When he returned, she was standing by the stove, the carving tied around her neck with a leather thong. Rowan stopped, surprised. "It suits you." She didn't answer. He cleared his throat. "Storm's gone. My ranch isn't far. Dusty spur, maybe half an hour's ride. Got work needs doing if you're looking to stay a while." Her head snapped up. "Work? Nothing fancy. Stitching tack, mending clothes. You'd get paid fair." Not charity. Her jaw tightened. You'd hire me? An Apache? He shrugged. I hire folks who work. Color don't matter to a horse, ma'am, and it sure as hell don't matter to me. The word ma'am again. She didn't know if it stung or soothed. You don't know me, she said. Don't need to, he replied. I've got more chores than daylight. He looked toward the children, still huddled together. You'd have food, a roof, a bed that doesn't leak when it rains. Luda said nothing. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had gone still, but her thoughts spun like tumbleweed. To work for him meant safety, for now. But it also meant debt, and debt meant binding. Her people had spent decades breaking chains. She wouldn't step into another willingly. Rowan seemed to sense the battle inside her. Don't decide for me, he said quietly. Decide for them. She followed his gaze to her children. Emma's hair tangled over her face. Samuel's arm draped protectively across Grace. The sight cracked something in her. Tahana's words echoed in her mind. Find the eagle, follow where it leads. Maybe this was the way. She looked at Rowan again. You'll pay me fair? He nodded once. Fair as any hand I've got. Then I'll do it. Good, he said simply, reaching for his hat. We'll leave after the little one's strong enough to ride. The next day, the sky opened blue and wide above the plains. Snow still clung to the grass in thin white ribbons. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Rowan saddled his mare, adjusted the reins, and lifted Grace up first. Emma climbed behind her. Samuel swung up with a grunt. Luda hesitated, standing at the edge of the cabin door. She looked back once. The place that had held her through the storm now empty, but not forgotten. The ashes in the stove, the faint scent of smoke on the walls. Reminders that even broken places could offer shelter. Rowan extended his hand. You coming? She hesitated only a second before placing her palm in his. His hand was rough, calloused, but warm. He pulled her up behind him. The horse shifted under their combined weight, snorted, then started forward. The wind was softer now, brushing against her face like breath instead of claws. She held Grace close, feeling the rhythm of hooves beneath them. As the cabin faded behind the ridge, Luda reached up to touch the eagle charm at her throat. Maybe Tahana was right. Maybe the spirits didn't speak through dreams or thunder, but through small mercies carved in wood and fire. Ahead, the land stretched endless and red. Somewhere beyond it waited Dusty Spur Ranch, the place where fate had decided to turn its reins. And behind them, the storm that once tried to kill them whispered its surrender to the sky. The first sight of the Dusty Spur Ranch took Luda's breath. The main house stood proud on a rise above the creek, timber walls the color of old honey, a long porch running its front like outstretched arms. Smoke drifted from a brick chimney, curling through the cold morning air. For Luda, who had slept under hide and canvas for years, the sight of steady smoke meant one thing only: permanence. Rowan swung down from the saddle and helped the children dismount. The air smelled of hay, horses, and something else. Warm, unfamiliar, spicy. From the porch, a woman stepped into view, wiping her hands on a linen apron. Her hair was pinned tight beneath a dark kerchief. Her sleeves rolled high, exposing strong, capable arms. Her eyes, narrow and sharp as a blade, cut across the yard before settling on Luda. So this is the woman, she said, her accent lilting but clear. Mrs. Chen, Rowan greeted. They'll be staying a while. Thought you could use another pair of hands for sewing and mending. Mrs. Chen's gaze swept over Luda, from the worn moccasins to the weather-stained dress, then to the three children clinging to her skirt. You said she can sew, Mrs. Chen said. People say many things. Luda held her ground. I can. Mrs. Chen tilted her head. Needle is small, easy to lose. Some women talk big until the first prick. Luda's eyes didn't waver. We Apache know how to keep hold of sharp things, she replied evenly. Needles, knives, promises. The silence that followed was heavy as saddle leather. Then, to Luda's surprise, Mrs. Chen's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close. Good, she said. Needles are same in every tongue. She turned toward the porch. Come, children hungry. Rowan exhaled quietly, almost amused. "You'll get along fine," he murmured, before leading his horse toward the barn. Inside, the house smelled of ginger and boiled rice, wood polish, and something sweet baking in the oven. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, its steam softening the chill that clung to Luda's bones. Mrs. Chen pointed toward the basin. "Girl, wash your hands. Boy, help chop wood." Samuel blinked. "I can chop." "Then do." Her tone left no room for doubt. Luda expected harshness, but there was no cruelty in it, only structure, the kind that kept chaos out of a home. She and Emma followed the older woman to the kitchen table. Mrs. Chen handed her a basket of torn shirts and trousers. "Mr. Tate works men hard," she said matter-of-factly. "They tear clothes faster than I can patch." Luda nodded, running her fingers across the fabric. It was coarse but clean. Her hands, used to deer hide and sinew, found the rhythm of the needle quickly. Stitch, pull, tie. Stitch, pull, tie. Mrs. Chen watched for a minute, then grunted approval. "You sew like woman who's done it to live." "I have." "Then you will eat well here." By sundown, the chores had a rhythm. Samuel carried firewood to the shed. Emma helped wash dishes under Mrs. Chen's sharp but patient supervision. Grace slept curled on a real wool blanket near the hearth, her cheeks flushed pink with warmth. Luda worked by the fire, mending a horse blanket. The crackle of flames and the gentle clink of pans formed a music she hadn't known she missed, the sound of a home breathing. Mrs. Chen moved around the kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who'd built her own world from scratch. Luda could tell she was used to running things, perhaps once for a husband long gone or a family left across the ocean. "Where do you come from?" Luda asked softly. Mrs. Chen didn't look up from the soup. "Canton, long way across water. Came when railroad still half built. My husband died before it finished." Luda nodded slowly. "My husband died on the trail north." The older woman stirred the pot. "So we are same then. Two widows in a man's world." Luda smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why we both still stand." Mrs. Chen gave a small laugh. Short, rough, but real. "Maybe so." Later, Rowan returned, dust and frost clinging to his coat. He paused at the doorway, watching the scene inside. Mrs. Chen ladling soup, Luda sewing by firelight, children drowsing nearby. For a man who had known too many winters alone, the sight hit him deep. "Smells good," he said. "Because I cooked," Mrs. Chen shot back. "Not because you found another stray." Rowan smiled. "You'll thank me when the mending's done." Luda glanced up briefly but said nothing. The light from the lamp caught the curve of her cheekbone, the steady movement of her hands as she stitched. There was grace there, quiet, disciplined, the kind of strength that didn't need proving. Mrs. Chen served each bowl with measured precision, one hand on her hip, the other ladling broth thick with vegetables. Luda took hers last, murmuring thanks. The first sip burned her tongue, sharp with ginger and pepper. She hadn't tasted anything so rich in years. Emma leaned close and whispered, "Mama, it's good." "Yes," Luda said softly, eyes on the fire. "It is." Across the table, Mrs. Chen watched her carefully. "You like it?" "I do." "Then you eat more." "Too thin. Wind could blow you away." Samuel snorted, trying to stifle a laugh. Mrs. Chen gave him a mock glare. "And you, eat slower or you choke." The boy straightened immediately. For the first time in months, laughter touched the room. Not loud, not carefree, but human. That night, after dishes were done and the house had quieted, Luda stepped onto the porch. The sky above was black velvet, pierced by 1,000 white stars. Somewhere far off, a coyote sang to the moon. Mrs. Chen joined her, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. "You sew well. I'd keep you on, if it were up to me." Luda smiled faintly. "I thought you didn't like strangers." Mrs. Chen shrugged. "I don't like lazy ones. You work hard. That's different." They stood in silence, watching their breath fade into the cold air. "I used to think this country had no place for women like us," Mrs. Chen said after a while. "But maybe we just have to carve a place out ourselves." Luda's hand went to the eagle charm at her neck. "The land takes from everyone." she said. But maybe it gives back, too, if you learn how to listen. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. The land, the kitchen, the needle, all same lesson. Patience. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing golden light against the windows. The sound of Emma's laughter drifted faintly from the back room as Samuel tried to mimic Mrs. Chen's strict tone. Luda's lips curved into a quiet smile. Seems the house has found its balance. Mrs. Chen chuckled. Don't tell the boss. He'll think I've gone soft. They both laughed softly, their voices blending with the hiss of the wind through the pines. 3 women, 1 Apache, 1 Chinese, 1 only a child, under the same roof, stitched together by need, by courage, by something that might one day be called friendship. Inside that wooden house on the Wyoming plain, the world's edges blurred just enough for kindness to take root. And for the first time since the storm, Luda no longer felt like a ghost drifting through borrowed places. She was part of something, fragile, imperfect, but alive. As she turned back toward the glow of the kitchen, she whispered to herself almost a prayer. 3 fires, 1 home. Spring came slow to the Wyoming plains. The snow melted into the thirsty soil, leaving streaks of red clay where the sun finally reached. The air no longer bit, it breathed. Wind carried the scent of pine sap and wet earth instead of frost and death. At Dusty Spur Ranch, the world began to move again. Horses snorted in the paddocks, chickens scurried across the yard, and from the porch came the rhythmic tap of Mrs. Chen's broom against the floorboards. Luda worked in the shade behind the house, sewing a torn saddlebag. Her fingers moved with the easy patience of habit. Apache hands that once stitched hides under firelight now worked beneath the wide western sky. Around her, 3 of the ranch girls bent over their own pieces of leather, watching her every move. Don't pull so tight, Luda told the youngest. You make the stitch angry, it breaks. The girl frowned. Angry? Luda smiled faintly. Leather is like people. Treat it with respect, and it'll hold you when you fall. The girls laughed, but they listened. Inside, Emma was at the kitchen table, tongue between her teeth, trying to copy letters onto a scrap of paper. Mrs. Chen, patient but firm, stood behind her. It looks like 3 steps. You climb it, you reach sky, again. Emma's small hand trembled, then steadied. She grinned when she got it right. Across the yard, Samuel followed Rowan Tate out to the east fence, the boy carrying a small hammer nearly too big for him. The 2 walked side by side, man and child, the distance between them shrinking with every step. The fence had seen better days. Rowan leaned against a post, squinting at the horizon. Weather'll tear this line again by fall, he muttered. Samuel mimicked his stance. Can we fix it anyway? Rowan grinned. That's the spirit. Man don't quit just because the wind will blow again. He handed the boy a nail. Samuel tried to hammer it, missed once, then again. Rowan knelt beside him, guiding his small hand. The sound of metal striking wood echoed sharp and clean across the pasture. From a distance, Luda watched them, her thread pausing mid-stitch. Sunlight fell across her face, warm and golden. For the first time since Tahana's death, she didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. That evening, as the sun bled into the ridges, Luda found Rowan repairing a gate near the corral. He had his sleeves rolled up, forearms streaked with dust and sweat. She approached quietly, her steps soft on the earth. You work more than the men you hire, she said. He didn't look up. Hard to ask others to do what I won't. She leaned against the fence post. You don't talk like the others. Shirker, Rowan chuckled. Maybe I've said enough wrong things in my life to learn when to shut up. They stood in silence, watching the horses graze beyond the rails. Then he spoke, voice low. You know, folks in Green River been talking. Say I've lost my mind. That Tate's got a squaw and her kids living under his roof, they say. Can't buy nails in town without hearing it. Luda's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. And what do you say back? He straightened, looked her dead in the eye. Nothing. Men like that already made up their minds. I used to be one of them. Her brow furrowed. One of them? I fought in the war, he said simply. Blue uniform, iron cross, orders I didn't question. We burned villages we didn't understand. I told myself it was duty. He took a deep breath, rubbing his jaw. Now I just want to live different. Make things grow instead of burn. Luda studied him, the muscles in her face relaxing. We believe the same thing then. My people say the earth remembers who treats it kind. Rowan nodded. Guess I'm hoping it remembers me kindly one day. He leaned on the post again, turning toward her. They also say you Apache don't believe in God. Luda's lips curved faintly. We believe in the land, the river, the wind, the sky, all part of the same spirit. She paused, eyes tracing the hills beyond. But maybe your God and our earth are just two names for the same thing. Rowan smiled, slow and genuine. That's about the wisest sermon I ever heard. Days passed, steady and full. Luda's hands grew rougher, stronger. She learned the ranch's rhythm, the clang of the dinner bell, the squeak of the barn doors at dawn, the sweet hum of Mrs. Chen's voice scolding Samuel for muddy boots. The children changed too. Emma no longer hid behind her mother's skirt. Samuel's laughter rang louder each day. Grace toddled through the house, clutching a piece of cloth Luda had sewn for her, a small stuffed eagle with crooked wings. Life, fragile and stubborn, had begun to bloom again, but not everyone shared the feeling. When Rowan rode into Green River for supplies, he caught the whispers. Look there! Tate's turned his place into an Apache camp. Don't take his cattle. That man's cursed himself. He ignored them at first, but one afternoon, an old rancher stepped out of the general store and spat at his boots. You think you're saving them, Tate? They'll take your land the minute you turn your back. Rowan's jaw tightened. Funny. Thought it was you who wanted my land last winter. The man sneered. You'll see soon enough. Blood don't mix. Rowan didn't swing, didn't shout, just looked him in the eye, cold and level. I used to believe that. Then I got tired of being wrong. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the ranch without looking back. That night, when the children were asleep, Rowan sat on the porch steps, cleaning his revolver. Luda stepped out quietly, shawl wrapped tight against the chill. You fought again? She asked. Just words. He smiled without humor. But words can bite deep. She sat beside him, folding her hands. My people say words are like arrows. Once loosed, they can't be taken back. Your people are right. They watched the stars rise together. For a while, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind and the rustle of horses in the corral. Rowan turned to her. You don't have to stay, you know. Could head north like you planned. Luda shook her head slowly. I thought I was following the eagle. Turns out he led me here. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. A week later, in the open pasture, Rowan showed Samuel how to whistle for the horses. Like this, he said, shaping his lips, blowing low and clear. A gray mare lifted her head, trotting over. Your turn. Samuel tried, spit flying, noise pitiful. Rowan laughed. Again. After 3 tries, a note rang true. The boy's eyes widened as the horse ambled closer. Rowan ruffled his hair. Told you, takes patience. You treat animals right, they'll come. From the edge of the field, Luda watched, arms crossed, eyes soft. The breeze lifted her hair as she smiled, small and quiet, like dawn breaking. Behind her, the house gleamed golden in the light, smoke curling gently into the blue sky. 3 women, 1 man, 3 children, none of them the same, yet all belonging somehow to this patch of stubborn earth. The land hadn't forgotten them. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen. The summer wind came early that year, dry, restless, full of dust that clung to every thought. Days stretched long, and nights hummed with crickets and worry. For a while, peace had felt real at Dusty Spur Ranch. The fences stood straight, the crops pushed through the red soil, and laughter came easy in the kitchen. Luda had begun to believe that maybe the world had finally grown tired of hurting her people. Then the messenger came. He rode in hard from the north, hat torn, horse lathered in sweat. Rowan met him by the gate, hand already near his revolver. The man's voice shook as he spoke. Camp by the river's gone, he said. Settlers found it, claimed the Apache were stealing cattle. They burned it to the ground. Luda stepped out onto the porch as the words fell like stones between them. How many? Rowan asked quietly. Don't know. Heard screams halfway to the ridge. Sheriff says not to go nosing. Luda didn't hear the rest. Her knees gave out, and the porch planks met her hands. Samuel ran forward, but she waved him back. Her breath came shallow, broken. The sound of wind in her ears turned into the scream she remembered from years ago. Villages burning, the same smell of smoke and blood, the same men who had sworn they came for peace. Rowan caught her before she fell completely. "They'll come here next," she whispered, trembling. "They'll say we don't belong, that the land don't remember us." Rowan's voice was steady but low. "You're safe here, Luda." "No one's safe," she said, shaking her head. "Not if you wear my skin." He gripped her shoulders, firm but gentle. "Listen to me. You don't have to run anymore. Not while I'm still breathing." Her eyes met his. Dark meeting light. The world seemed to hold still. "You don't know what you're promising," she said. "Yes, I do," he replied. "I promised a man once that I'd never watch another innocent die. I mean to keep it." The silence between them was full of thunder. Then Luda broke down, her forehead resting against his chest, tears soaking the dust from his shirt. He didn't speak again, just held her as the wind howled across the plains. That night, the ranch was quieter than usual. Even the horses seemed to sense something unsettled in the air. Luda sat by the window long after everyone else had gone to bed. The moon hung low and gold, the kind that made the world look like it was burning all over again. She clutched the eagle charm in her hand, thumb tracing the soot-dark grooves. Behind her, Rowan's boots sounded softly on the floor. "You should rest," he said. "I can't," she whispered. He stood beside her, looking out at the land that rolled away into shadows. "I know the feeling." She glanced up. "You've lost too?" He nodded. "During the war, I did things that still wake me at night. Burned houses, took orders I shouldn't have. I told myself it was duty, but it was pride. The kind that blinds a man till he can't tell justice from revenge." Luda turned to him, the firelight catching in her eyes. "And now? Now I build fences instead of burning them." He gave a dry smile. "Doesn't fix the past, but it's a start." She studied him for a long moment, then quietly, "The man who burned your soul, was he forgiven?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "I reckon that's up to the Lord." She shook her head. "Maybe it's up to you." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not pity, but understanding. The kind that comes from carrying the same scars in different skins. When he left her to the silence, she sat there a while longer, staring out at the land. A soft wind moved through the grass, whispering her husband's name. That night she dreamed. She stood by the riverbank under a blood-orange sky. The air shimmered with heat, and across the water she saw Tahana, tall and proud as he once was, the eagle charm still shining against his chest. "You found the man," he said. Luda's voice trembled. "He's not like the others. He listens." Tahana smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. "He doesn't take the land. He grows it. The world needs men who plant more than they burn." Her eyes filled. "Am I betraying you?" He shook his head. "You're keeping your promise. You're still following the eagle." She reached for him, but the river widened between them. "Go," he said. "You've walked too long in ashes. Time to walk in grass again." Then he was gone, and the river went silent. Luda woke before dawn, heart pounding, tears drying on her cheeks. The fire in the hearth had gone to embers. Rowan was asleep in the chair beside it, his hat tipped low over his eyes, rifle propped against his knee. He'd stayed awake as long as he could, guarding the house. She rose quietly, bare feet silent on the wood. The air smelled of smoke and sage. For a moment she just stood there, watching him. This man who carried his guilt like armor, who had given her and her children a piece of the peace he'd been chasing. The eagle charm lay heavy in her hand. Without a sound, she bent down and slipped it over his neck. The wood touched his skin, resting against his heartbeat. "For protection," she whispered, "and for remembering." Rowan stirred, half waking. "Luda?" She froze. He blinked, saw her standing there, moonlight haloing her hair. "You okay?" "Yes," she said softly. "For the first time, maybe I am." He reached up, fingers brushing the charm. "You sure you want to give this away?" "It doesn't belong to one person," she said. "It belongs to whoever listens." Their eyes met, long, quiet, full of everything words couldn't carry. Rowan stood slowly. The room was bathed in half-light, gold from the dying fire and silver from the dawn creeping through the window. He took a step closer. "Luda," she shook her head slightly but didn't move back. "Don't speak. The wind will hear." He smiled faintly, then lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were rough, trembling, reverent. When their lips met, it wasn't fever or hunger, it was recognition. The meeting of two storms that had finally spent themselves. The kiss was brief, honest, fragile as morning frost. When it broke, they just stood there, forehead to forehead, breathing the same quiet air. Outside, the horizon was turning pink, light spilling over the ridge and into the valley like forgiveness made visible. Rowan's voice came low, almost a vow. "Whatever happens, this place, this home, will be yours as much as mine." Luda closed her eyes. "Then the spirits led me right." That day, when the sun rose full, the Dusty Spur Ranch woke to something new. Not safety, never that, but a kind of stillness, as if the land itself had chosen to rest for a while. Mrs. Chen hummed as she boiled water for tea. Emma chased Samuel around the barn, their laughter echoing off the hills. Grace toddled through the doorway, carrying a wooden spoon like a scepter. Luda stood in the yard, face turned toward the wind. For the first time, it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like blessing. She thought of the burned camp by the river, of ashes still cooling somewhere north of here. But she also thought of her husband's words, of Rowan's hands, of the eagle charm resting over a heart that had once been full of fire, and now finally had room for hope. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest cry of an eagle overhead. Luda smiled. The ghosts had not left her. They had simply learned to walk beside her. The Wyoming wind had changed again. Where once it had howled like grief, it now carried the lazy hum of summer, brushing over green shoots, pushing through the red soil. Dusty Spur Ranch breathed easier. Its fences stood firm, its fields alive. Out back, the old horse barn leaned against the horizon like an aging giant. Its beams sagged, its doors creaked, and sunlight poured through the cracks in golden shafts. Most men would have torn it down. Rowan Tate saw something else. He stood inside with a hammer in hand, sleeves rolled up, and a quiet smile beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him, Luda brushed away cobwebs from the rafters, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, her face streaked with sawdust and light. "What are you thinking?" she asked, watching him eye the space. "I'm thinking this old barn's seen too much good weather to quit now," Rowan said. "Needs a new purpose." Luda tilted her head. "And what purpose might that be?" He rested his weight on a beam. "A place for those who got nowhere else to go. Men like the ones the world forgot. Apache, half-breeds, drifters. Teach them to work, to ride, to mend what's broken." Her eyes softened. "A place to start again." He nodded. "Exactly that." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Easy, familiar. Outside, Samuel's laughter echoed as he chased a stray chicken across the yard. Rowan set down his hammer. "You'll help me run it?" Luda smiled, small and certain. "I've been fixing what's broken my whole life. Might as well make it official." That afternoon, the barn came alive again. Rowan and Samuel replaced rotten boards while Emma scrubbed the stalls clean. Luda strung blankets into makeshift beds for the first two wanderers who arrived. Quiet men with Apache blood and eyes like the horizon, brought by word of mouth. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, arms folded, a disapproving look half hiding her pride. "You bring more mouths, you bring more work," she said. Rowan grinned. "You ever known me to be scared of work?" "Scared? No. Foolish? Yes." But later that evening, she brewed a pot of ginger tea and poured it into tin cups for the new men. "Drink," she said, "so your bones don't ache tomorrow." They nodded their thanks, shy, grateful. "Good land needs good people," she said, her voice softer now. "Don't matter where they come from." The words hung in the dusty air like a prayer. As weeks turned to months, the barn became more than a shelter. It was a heartbeat. At sunrise, the clang of hammers and the rustle of hay filled the valley. Luda trained the newcomers in leatherwork, her voice patient but firm. Rowan rode with them into the canyons, teaching them how to find water, how to move cattle without fear. In the evenings, the sound of laughter and harmonica music drifted across the plains. Mrs. Chen scolded when they got too loud, but she always left extra bread on the table. The townsfolk still whispered, "Tate's turned his ranch into an Indian camp." Rowan didn't bother explaining. The ranch itself was explanation enough. Crops thrived, horses grew strong, and for the first time in years, peace felt earned. One evening, as twilight settled in lavender and gold, Rowan found Luda sitting outside the barn, mending a saddle strap. The sky stretched wide and endless above her, painted with streaks of fire. He leaned against the post beside her. "Looks good," he said, nodding toward the rebuilt stalls. She smiled. "So does the land." He followed her gaze. The fields beyond glowed in the dying light, alive and forgiving. "Never thought I'd see this place full again," he admitted. "Guess I owe that to you." She shook her head. "You owe it to the land. We just listened when it spoke." Rowan chuckled. "And what's it say now?" Luda looked up at the darkening sky. "It says we've both walked far enough." That night, the ranch gathered under the porch lights for supper. The table was crowded. Mrs. Chen, the children, the two new hands, and Rowan and Luda side by side. The food was simple: stew, bread, and a jug of cider. But there was laughter, and that made it a feast. When Mrs. Chen caught Samuel sneaking seconds before Grace, she tapped him lightly with a spoon. "Patience," she said sternly, though her eyes were smiling. Luda laughed quietly. "You've turned my boy into your apprentice." Mrs. Chen sniffed. "Somebody has to teach him manners. He learns faster than his mother." Rowan grinned across the table. "Don't start a war in my house, ladies." Mrs. Chen pointed her spoon at him. "It's our house now, Mr. Tate." The words stopped him cold, but not in a bad way. He looked around the table at the mismatched faces, the warmth, the noise, the life. She was right. It wasn't just his anymore. When the meal was done and the children had fallen asleep near the fire, Luda stepped outside. The sky was burning with sunset, red and gold spilling across the plains like spilled paint. Grace stirred in her arms, small fingers tangled in her mother's braid. Rowan joined her quietly, boots crunching on the porch boards. He stood beside her, tipping his hat against the light. "Never gets old, does it?" he said softly. "No," Luda whispered. "The land always remembers who tends it." He looked down at her, eyes warm beneath the brim. "You've done more than tend it. You've brought it back to life." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, Rowan, we both did." He hesitated, then reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the railing. "You and the children, you belong here. I want you to know that." Luda's throat tightened. "You've given us more than I ever dared hope." "You gave me something too," he said. "You gave me peace." She looked up at him, eyes shining in the amber light. "Then we've both found what we were looking for." He nodded slowly, then said, voice low and sure, "I promise you this. You and those kids will never sleep in a tent again, not while I'm still drawing breath." Luda turned toward him fully, her expression soft but fierce. "Storms will still come," she said. "Then we'll face them together," he replied. She reached for his hand, fingers weaving through his. "Maybe for the first time," she said, "I have a home." Rowan smiled. "You are home." Above them, a sudden shadow passed over the porch. Luda looked up. High in the reddened sky, a pair of eagles wheeled together, their wings catching the last light of day. One dipped low, circling the barn, then soared again, free and steady. She felt her breath catch, tears pricking her eyes. "He's still watching," she murmured. "Who?" Rowan asked. "Tahana," she said. "He's happy for us." Rowan took off his hat, holding it against his chest. "Then I hope he knows I'll spend the rest of my life earning that trust." Hakutanun. Luda smiled through her tears, the wind lifting her hair. "He knows." As the sun dropped behind the hills, shadows stretched across the ranch, long and gentle. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling upward like a prayer. Mrs. Chen's laughter drifted from the kitchen. The children stirred in their beds. The horses in the barn settled for the night, hooves soft against the straw. And outside, under that endless Wyoming sky, Rowan and Luda stood hand in hand, two survivors of two worlds that had finally found one home. The camera would have pulled back then, slow and wide, showing the house glowing like a lantern in the dusk, smoke trailing upward, eagles circling high above the roof. The harmonica's lonely tune would rise and fade into the wind, and the last light of day would fall across the land like a promise kept. The winter in the valley was unforgiving, its icy grip tightening around the land like the hand of a vengeful ghost. A gray, steel-colored sky hung low, threatening to crack open with the weight of the storm that seemed to always be just around the corner. The ground, hardened by frost and snow, crunched beneath the hooves of Asher Boone's horse as he rode slowly along the frozen river, his breath clouding in the cold air. Asher was a man alone in a world that was as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. His cabin, little more than a weather-beaten structure tucked away at the edge of the river, was his only companion. The cabin was small but sturdy, much like the man who lived in it. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the worn walls. The smell of damp wood and smoke lingered in the air. This place, this lonely corner of the world, was where Asher found his peace. There was no family here, no bustling towns or neighbors. Just the land, the livestock, and the constant hum of labor. Every day was the same. Rise before dawn, tend to the cattle, chop wood, mend fences. The work was never done, but neither was the solitude. The silence of the land matched the silence in his heart, a silence that spoke more of pain than comfort. The questions that had brought Asher to this life were simple, though no less heavy. What had driven him to choose this remote corner of the world, far from the rest of mankind? The answer, as it often is in these parts, was in the past. The war, the bloodshed, the death of his younger brother. All those things had shaped Asher into the man he had become. A man who preferred the company of cattle to people, the quiet of the mountains to the bustle of a town. His brother Samuel had died in an ambush while they were on a scouting mission. A bullet meant for Asher finding its mark on Samuel instead. Asher had held him in his arms as the life drained from his body, the cold desert wind carrying away his last breath. Afterward, Asher had tried to return to the life they had once shared, but the world had become a different place. Samuel's absence was like a hole in the ground, and Asher had never been able to fill it. He had returned home from the war a changed man, but nothing could change the fact that Samuel was gone. And so he came here, to this land where no one knew him and no one could ask him questions about his past. Here he could be the man he was now, a man shaped by grief and guilt, but at least he was alone. And in a way, that was the only peace he could find. But the quiet of the valley would not last forever. As the days grew longer and the seasons changed, Asher's life would begin to shift, though he would not know it at the time. Change comes slowly in these parts, creeping like a shadow, but when it does come, it doesn't ask for permission. And for Asher, the change would come in the form of a woman. But that story, well, that would take some time to unfold. The cold was biting that day, sharper than the usual winter chill in the valley. Asher Boone, bundled up in layers of worn clothing, rode out before dawn with a mission that didn't require much thought. He was heading to the Apache camp to deliver a small bundle of herbs and medicine, nothing more. The journey wasn't new to him. It was a routine that kept him from the silence of his cabin, a kind of escape that didn't ask much of him. The snow crunched beneath his horse's hooves and the pines swayed, their branches heavy with ice. The world was muffled, the only sound the wind cutting through the trees and the occasional distant howl of coyotes. Asher had long since gotten used to the desolation of the land. His world had been shaped by solitude, his every move made in rhythm with the harshness of the wilderness. He didn't expect anything unexpected. The land had never given him surprises, not until this day. He was passing through a small stand of trees when he heard it. A faint cry, distant but desperate, carried on the wind. Asher pulled the reins of his horse sharply, his boots digging into the snow to slow the animal. He turned his head, squinting through the bare branches in the frosty air. There it was again, a shout, this time clearer. It was a voice tinged with pain. Without a second thought, Asher dismounted, tying his horse loosely to a nearby tree. His hand instinctively went to the rifle on his back, but his feet moved swiftly toward the source of the cry. His instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of the wilderness, told him to be cautious. But something in that voice, something in the urgency, compelled him to move faster. He pushed through the dense underbrush, the cold biting his face until he reached the clearing. There, at the center of the small Apache camp, was the figure he'd been searching for. A man lying on the ground, blood staining the snow beneath him. The Apache chief. Asher froze for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. The chief's men moved frantically around him, their faces tight with fear and worry, but no one was stepping forward to help. No healer was nearby. The chief's wound, an ugly gunshot to the side, was bleeding freely, and his chest heaved with every breath, each one more labored than the last. The warriors were watching Asher, their eyes wary and cautious, but they did not move to stop him. Asher didn't hesitate. He had seen death before, in every shape and form. He had learned the art of life-saving in the brutality of war, and in that moment, all of that training kicked in. He knelt beside the chief without a word, his hands moving quickly and efficiently as he began to work. The men and women of the camp looked on in silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and hope. They didn't trust easily. The Apache people were a proud people, and they didn't take kindly to outsiders, least of all a man who bore the scars of the very conflict that had ravaged their lands. But in the heat of battle, survival often required sacrifices. Asher had proven himself worthy of this one. He tore the chief's shirt away, exposing the blood-soaked wound. Asher worked quickly, his hands steady despite the pressure mounting on his chest. He knew what was at stake. If the chief died, the tribe would be thrown into chaos. They would have no leader, and if he didn't do something now, it would be too late. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. Asher stayed by the chief's side, his hands soaked in blood as he carefully stitched up the wound and packed it with herbs. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The language of survival was universal, and in that moment, it was the only thing that mattered. When he finished, the camp was eerily quiet. The chief's breathing had steadied, and his color had returned to a healthier hue, though he was still unconscious. Asher wiped his brow, his fingers numb from the cold. He stood looking around at the gathered Apache, each of them watching him intently. The sun had begun to set by the time the chief regained consciousness. He looked up at Asher with hazy eyes, his face gaunt and drawn. But there was a gleam of gratitude in those eyes, a silent understanding that passed between them. The chief struggled to sit up, wincing in pain as his warriors helped him into an upright position. His voice was hoarse, but strong enough to be heard. "You saved my life," the chief said, his words heavy with both respect and a certain weight of responsibility. His eyes met Asher's, steady and unwavering. "For this, you have earned my respect." He paused, then gestured toward his daughters, who had gathered quietly behind him. "Choose one of my daughters as your reward. She will go with you and serve you in whatever way you desire." Asher stood still, the weight of the offer settling over him like a cloud. He didn't want any reward. He wasn't here to take anything from these people, especially not something as sacred as one of their daughters. He shook his head, his expression firm and resolute. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "I don't need anything. I did what I had to, that's all." The chief regarded him for a long moment, as if weighing Asher's words carefully. The men around them murmured quietly, unsure how to react. Asher could feel their eyes on him, skeptical, questioning, but not hostile. The chief's gaze shifted toward his daughters, and for a brief moment, his eyes lingered on one in particular. Sahoya. She was standing at the back of the group, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Asher's eyes met hers, and for just a fleeting second, there was a shift, a subtle, unspoken understanding between them. She wasn't like the others. She was different, stronger maybe, or perhaps just more determined. Her eyes didn't hold fear or uncertainty. Instead, they seemed to speak of something deeper, something Asher couldn't quite place, but something he felt nonetheless. Sahoya didn't step forward, but she didn't step back either. Her gaze never wavered from Asher's, and in that moment, it was as if she had made a decision. She was the one who would follow him, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Asher felt a strange mix of emotions: uncertainty, hesitation, and something else. Something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. He didn't want a companion. He didn't want anyone to rely on him. But in the face of Sahoya's silent decision, he couldn't ignore what was unfolding before him. I don't need anyone," Asher muttered, his words falling flat, but his eyes never left hers. "I'm just a man who keeps to himself." The chief looked at Asher, then back at his daughter. After a long pause, he nodded slowly, as if finally understanding. "She is strong. She will choose her path. She has chosen you." Asher didn't know how to respond. He didn't want this. But as he turned to leave the camp, he felt the weight of Sahoya's eyes still on him, following him, even as the others watched in silence. It wasn't a choice Asher made. It was a choice Sahoya made. And in that moment, Asher realized that, whether he wanted it or not, his life would never be the same. As they walked back to his horse, Sahoya didn't speak a word. She simply followed him, her face set in a quiet determination. Asher didn't look back, but in his chest he felt the unmistakable pull of something new beginning. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there, growing, shifting in the space between them. The journey back to the cabin would be long, the silence thick between them. But in that silence, Asher felt a stirring, something he hadn't felt in years, a connection. And though he couldn't bring himself to admit it, he knew that, no matter what happened next, his solitary life would soon be a thing of the past. The cold winds of winter had a way of biting deeper out in the valley, where the land stretched out flat and endless, just like the time that seemed to pass so slow. Asher Boone had always felt at home in the stillness of the wilderness, his ranch being little more than a patch of land that didn't ask for much. Just a roof, a few walls, and the endless work of raising cattle and managing the crops that barely survived the harsh seasons. But now, with Sahoya following him back to the ranch, that stillness was about to shift in ways Asher wasn't ready for. He hadn't asked for her to come along, but she had chosen to follow him, an offer, or maybe more of a decision, she had made on her own. His cabin was simple, no comforts beyond the bare essentials: a stone fireplace, a worn table, a single bed tucked against the wall. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the smell of damp wood and earthy soil filled the air. It wasn't much to look at, but to Asher, it was everything. It was his life. It was his peace. He didn't want it to change. He had spent years carving out a life here, in this place where he could be left alone with his thoughts, his work, and the land that had given him both the freedom and the solitude to escape the past. But when Sahoya stepped into his world, she brought something with her, a presence that Asher didn't know how to deal with. For the first few days, Asher kept his distance. He let her settle into the corner of the cabin with the few belongings she had: blankets, a small bundle of clothes, and a bundle of herbs she had wrapped tightly to her chest. It was a quiet existence, one that was familiar to Asher, but something had shifted in the air. He wasn't alone anymore, and the truth of that hung heavily between them, unspoken. Asher had always believed that silence was where a man found his peace. The rhythm of the day was simple: tend to the cattle, fix the fences, chop the firewood, mend the roof before the next snowstorm hit. It was a life that had kept him busy and, in its way, distracted him from the darker corners of his mind. But Sahoya wasn't like the people Asher had known. She didn't stay still. She didn't sit quietly by the fire, staring out into the night. No, she was too active for that. She moved around the cabin, folding blankets, sweeping the floor, organizing the little bits of food Asher kept in the cupboard. Her hands, though rough from the harsh life she had lived, seemed to bring a kind of order to his space. It was strange seeing her in his home, watching her tend to the small things that, to him, had never mattered. He had grown used to the silence, to the routine, but she brought a new kind of energy, one he couldn't quite place. Her presence was there, hovering between them like a quiet whisper, always there but never intruding. She worked quietly. She never spoke much, but her eyes were always watching him. Asher didn't mind that. It was as if she was learning the rhythm of the land just as he had, the rhythm of survival. She helped when he needed it, feeding the chickens, gathering the eggs, checking the traps for small game, and sometimes even mending a piece of clothing when it was torn. Asher didn't ask her to do any of this, but in the quiet moments, when the sun hung low in the sky and the wind howled in the distance, he could feel something shifting. The work wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about getting through another day. For the first time in years, Asher found himself thinking beyond the present moment. He thought about the future, a future that didn't feel so solitary. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it was about small things. "The fire's dying," Sahoya would say, her voice low and soft. Or, "The cattle are grazing near the stream. Need to move them before sundown." Asher didn't need to speak more than necessary. He had never been one for idle chatter. But the silence, though comfortable, began to feel different now. Sahoya's quiet presence made him realize just how much he had lived without over the years. She was a reminder that people could matter, not just as company, but as part of the world he had built for himself. Each morning they worked side by side with no real conversation, but something deeper began to pass between them, a kind of unspoken understanding. He didn't need to tell her what needed doing, and she didn't ask questions about the things he didn't say. She just moved through the day as if she belonged, her presence as steady as the sun rising over the hills. There were moments, though, when Sahoya would look at him with those steady eyes of hers, and Asher would feel something stir in him, something old and buried. He would quickly look away, focusing instead on the task at hand. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that was growing in his chest. It was an ache, slow and steady, like the pull of the earth itself, calling him to something he wasn't ready to face. He began to notice the way Sahoya moved, how her hands worked quickly and precisely, how she would fix something in the cabin without being asked. He watched the way she tended to the cattle, how she would coax a stubborn cow to follow with just a soft word and a steady hand. She wasn't afraid of hard work, and though he hadn't realized it before, neither was he. For the first time in years, Asher felt a sense of partnership, not the kind that came from obligation or convenience, but something deeper, something rooted in the land and the work they shared. Over the course of those first few weeks, Asher came to accept the presence of Sahoya in his life. It wasn't an easy thing for him to admit. He had spent so many years avoiding connection, keeping people at arm's length. But with her, it felt different. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone who came to take something from him. She was someone who simply belonged to the land, to the rhythm of the day, to the quiet that surrounded them. The mornings were still cold, and the wind still howled through the valley. But something about the way Sahoya moved through the world, how she worked, how she existed, had begun to melt the coldness in Asher's heart. He could still hear the echoes of the past, the voice of his brother calling out from the grave, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. But those moments grew fewer now, replaced by something new, a feeling of being needed. It was subtle, the change that was creeping in. Asher didn't wake up one day to find himself full of hope or joy, but the days began to feel different. He no longer went through them mechanically, surviving without thought. Now there was something more. There was purpose. And with that, Asher realized that he wasn't alone anymore, not just in body, but in spirit. Sahoya had become something more than just a guest in his life. She was a part of it. And though he didn't yet understand what that meant, it was enough to keep him from turning back to the past he had tried so hard to bury. For the first time in a long while, Asher felt something stir inside him, a kind of peace that came from sharing the work, from knowing that no matter what happened, there was someone by his side. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even trust, fully. But it was the beginning of something new, something Asher hadn't expected when he first crossed paths with Sahoya. And that, in itself, was enough to change everything. The sun hung low that afternoon, bleeding a soft amber light over the valley. The snow had begun to thin, leaving patches of hard earth exposed between the drifts. Asher Boone was out near the tree line, checking the traps he'd set the day before. The air was sharp, the kind that bit into your lungs and reminded you that winter wasn't done yet. His boots crunched against the frost, each step echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. He had done this 1,000 times, followed the same trail, checked the same iron traps, listened to the same sounds of the wind whispering through the pines. Routine had always kept him steady, but that afternoon something felt off. The silence wasn't the same. It was heavier. Watching. He crouched near one of the traps and froze. There were tracks in the snow. Not animal, not his. Human. Fresh. The prints were shallow, light, made by someone moving carefully. Whoever it was had been near his traps, maybe even near the cabin. Asher's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The wind carried no sound, but the feeling in his gut was enough. Someone had been here, close enough to watch. He squatted again, brushing his gloved fingers over the prints. They headed west, back toward the ridge. That ridge overlooked his land, his cabin, in the small fenced corral where the cattle fed. Asher's pulse thudded in his chest. He'd seen this before. The signs, the stillness before trouble. And just like that, the past came roaring back. Loud, raw, and merciless. The smell of gunpowder, the screams of his brother, the way Samuel's blood soaked into the dirt of some godforsaken hill during the war. He could still feel the weight of his brother's body in his arms, the last breath leaving him while Asher shouted his name into the smoke and chaos. He had run from that memory for years, buried it under layers of work, solitude, and silence. But the snow couldn't hide those prints any more than Asher could hide his ghosts. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the fading light, until the sound of footsteps behind him broke his trance. He turned sharply, his hand moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was Sahoya, bundled in a coat that hung loose over her shoulders, her dark hair braided against the wind. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. One look at his face told her enough. "There are tracks," he said, voice low. "Someone's been here." She moved closer, her eyes scanning the snow, reading the signs like she had been born to it. "They watched," she said quietly. "Not come close, just watched." Asher nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of." That night, the wind howled through the valley, shaking the shutters and whispering against the roof. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light throwing soft orange shadows against the wooden walls. Asher sat at the table, oiling his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't just cleaning a gun, he was calming his mind, preparing himself for something he didn't yet understand. Sahoya sat near the fire, mending one of his shirts. The sound of her needle sliding through the fabric was the only thing keeping the room from falling into silence. "You think it's raiders?" she asked without looking up. "Could be," Asher replied. "Could be someone passing through. But no one passes through this valley by accident." He looked toward the window again, eyes narrowing. "They might have seen the smoke from the chimney. Might have seen us." Sahoya nodded slowly, setting the shirt aside. "You fought before?" she said softly, not as a question but as a fact. "You know this feeling?" Asher's jaw flexed. "Yeah," he muttered. "Too damn well." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and the memories pressed harder. Every flicker of flame brought back flashes, his brother's face, the smell of blood, the sound of a single gunshot that had ended everything. He could still hear Samuel's voice, young, full of that wild confidence he'd always carried. "You can't protect everyone, Ash. Sometimes you just gotta ride it out." The memory struck him like a hammer. Asher clenched his jaw, forcing it away. But memories don't stay buried forever. They just wait until you're quiet enough to hear them again. Sahoya stood and crossed the small space between them, laying a hand gently on his arm. "The war is not here," she said quietly. "Not now." Her voice was steady, strong, in a way that anchored him. She didn't say it to comfort him. She said it like a truth, and Asher, for a moment, believed her. But deep down, he knew better. War never really leaves a man. It just changes its shape. The next morning, the valley was quiet again. Too quiet. A thin fog hung over the land, blurring the edges of the trees and the river. Asher stepped outside before dawn, his rifle slung across his shoulder, scanning the horizon. No movement. No sound but the steady rush of the river beneath the ice. Still he felt it. The unease. The sense that something was out there, watching from the trees. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, boots sinking into the slush where the snow had begun to melt. Every fence post, every track, every shadow felt like something waiting to happen. He wasn't just looking for danger now, he was anticipating it. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had started to rise. Sahoya was already awake, tending to the fire, the smell of coffee and corn mash filling the air. She looked up at him, reading his face like she always did. "Nothing?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said, "but that doesn't mean safe." She didn't flinch at his words. She just nodded, as if danger was an old acquaintance she'd already met before. And maybe it was. Asher sat by the door, tightening the straps on his holster. His movements were mechanical, practiced. He wasn't just preparing for an attack. He was preparing for what the land might demand of him next. In his mind, he saw every possible scenario. Raiders coming through the ridge, thieves looking for easy prey, or worse, men from his past, men who might still carry grudges from the war. He looked up and found Sahoya watching him. Her eyes were calm but searching. "You think they come for you?" she asked quietly. Asher didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. But a part of him feared it, because deep down he'd always believed that trouble was something you could outrun only for so long before it caught up again. "Maybe," he said finally, "but if they do, they'll find I'm not the same man I was back then." As the day stretched on, Asher found himself pacing near the edge of the cabin, every sense tuned to the land around him. The ghosts of his past weren't content to stay quiet anymore. They whispered in the crunch of the snow, in the creak of the barn door, in the stillness between breaths. He could see Samuel in his mind again, laughing, alive, young, and then gone. That was the hardest part of memory, the way it could trick you into believing for a second that the dead were still within reach. When night came, Asher sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, the stars cutting through the sky like shards of glass. Sahoya joined him after a while, sitting beside him in silence. They didn't speak because there was nothing to say. Out here, words didn't mean much. The land spoke louder. Finally, after a long while, Asher said quietly, "If someone comes for this place, for us, I'll be ready." Sahoya looked at him, her eyes catching the firelight from inside the cabin. "You not fight alone," she said simply. He nodded once, but the words hit deeper than she probably knew. For years, he'd lived by one rule: don't let anyone close enough to need you, or worse, for you to need them. But now, sitting beside this woman who had walked into his life uninvited and stayed without asking permission, Asher realized that maybe needing someone wasn't the same as weakness. Maybe it was the only thing keeping him standing. That night, long after Sahoya had gone to sleep, Asher stayed awake, staring into the fire. Outside, the valley was silent, but inside, his thoughts roared. The ghosts of the past had returned, but this time, he wasn't facing them alone. And for the first time since the war, he wasn't afraid. Spring had finally come to the valley, though the land was still shaking off winter's grip. Patches of green were beginning to show through the muddy snowmelt, and the river that had once been a frozen vein of silence now rushed with new life. The air smelled different, warmer, alive, full of the promise that maybe things could start again. Asher Boone stood by the corral, hammering a new plank onto the fence. The cattle moved lazily nearby, their breath rising in faint clouds under the morning sun. He'd always liked this time of year, the renewal, the quiet rhythm of work. But this spring felt different. It wasn't just the thaw, it was something in the air between him and Sahoya. She was kneeling by the garden bed near the cabin, turning the soil with her hands. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as she worked. Asher caught himself watching her longer than he meant to, then turned back to his hammering, muttering under his breath. Peace. That was what this place had given him. But in the back of his mind, Asher had learned one thing from life out here. Peace never lasted long. He was right. By mid-afternoon, a shadow broke the horizon, a small figure on horseback, riding fast along the ridge. Asher shaded his eyes, squinting against the glare. The rider was small, barely more than a boy, his long hair whipping in the wind. He rode with the kind of urgency that made Asher's gut twist. As the rider drew closer, Sahoya looked up, her face tightening. She recognized the markings on the boy's clothing before Asher did. "Apache," she murmured, standing slowly. The boy dismounted before the horse had even stopped, his chest heaving with effort. He looked barely 14, but his eyes carried the same weight Asher had seen in grown men who'd seen too much. He spoke first to Sahoya, in the soft rhythm of his people's tongue. His voice was trembling, his words spilling out too quickly. Sahoya listened in silence, her face shifting. Confusion, disbelief, and then a spark of something Asher hadn't seen in her for a long time. Hope. Finally, she turned toward Asher, her voice shaking. "My sister," she said. "She's alive." Asher froze, the hammer still in his hand. The boy looked at him now, switching to broken English. "Your woman's sister," he said carefully. "She hide with small camp near the canyon south of White Mesa. Raiders. They burned the others, but she run, she live." For a moment the world seemed to still. The only sound was the wind cutting through the grass, the creak of the corral gate swinging open. Sahoya's hands covered her mouth. She was trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief. After all this time, the weight she'd been carrying, the loss she'd accepted as final, it wasn't final at all. Asher took a slow breath. "You're sure?" he asked. The boy nodded. "I saw her. She sent me. She say her name, Nadia." Sahoya's knees nearly gave out. She leaned against the fence, her eyes brimming. For the first time since he'd known her, Asher saw tears fall freely down her face. Not tears of grief, but of something gentler, something long overdue. That night, the cabin was alive with quiet motion. Sahoya moved like a woman reborn, gathering supplies, wrapping blankets, whispering prayers in her native tongue. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing golden light over her determined face. Asher sat at the table watching her. He hadn't seen this kind of light in her eyes before. For months, she had lived with a quiet strength, her spirit tempered by survival. But now there was something fierce burning inside her again. A purpose. "You really think she's out there?" he said finally. Sahoya turned to him, her eyes steady. "I know she is. My sister. She was younger, but strong. Always strong. I thought she'd gone, but now..." Her voice broke slightly, then steadied again. "Now I go." Asher leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You know what's out there. White Mesa's not safe country. Raiders run that stretch. The army don't go near it. It's rough land, even for folks who know it." "Ah," she didn't flinch. "I go anyway." He looked at her for a long time. Her determination reminded him of something, maybe of himself once, before he'd learned to live with giving up. He'd told himself he was done fighting for things that could be taken away. But now, watching her, he felt that quiet ache again. The one that told him maybe he wasn't finished after all. He sighed and stood. "Then you won't be going alone." Sahoya froze, turning to him slowly. "You would come?" Asher met her gaze. "Someone's got to watch your back. That country isn't forgiving." He paused, his voice low. "Besides, this place owes you something. So do I." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, for the first time since she had come to his cabin, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, quiet curve of her lips. But it carried more weight than any words could. They spent the next day preparing. Asher packed his saddlebag with rations, jerked meat, coffee grounds, dried beans, cartridges for his rifle. Sahoya packed herbs, bandages, and a small pouch of keepsakes. The horses were restless, their hooves thudding against the earth, sensing the journey ahead. Asher checked the rifle one last time, slinging it over his shoulder. The sun was setting when they stood at the edge of the property, the wind carrying the smell of thawing pine and earth. The land stretched endlessly before them, dangerous, vast, and uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Asher didn't feel that old emptiness pressing in on him. Instead, there was something else. Purpose. He turned to Sahoya. "You sure about this?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I find her, no matter what waits." Asher smiled faintly. "Then let's ride." They rode out at dawn, the cold mist still clinging to the valley. The trail wound through ridges and streams swollen with melted snow. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and blooming sagebrush. Sahoya rode ahead sometimes, her eyes sharp, scanning the distance. Asher followed, watching the way she moved, steady, sure, unafraid. It struck him then how far she'd come from the frightened woman he'd met that winter. She wasn't someone who needed saving anymore. She was someone who had given him a reason to live again. As the miles fell away behind them, Asher felt something shift deep inside. For so long, his life had been about survival, getting through each day, keeping his head down, avoiding pain. But now, with Sahoya beside him and the open land stretching endlessly ahead, he realized that maybe life wasn't just about surviving. Maybe it was about finding something or someone worth the risk. That thought scared him more than any outlaw or ghost from his past ever could. But it also made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. That night, they made camp near the river. The sky above them was endless, filled with 1,000 stars that burned cold and bright. Asher sat by the fire, his hat pulled low, while Sahoya tended to the horses. When she returned, she sat beside him in silence, watching the flames. After a while, she spoke softly. "When I find her, maybe we build something new. Not like before. Different, but free." Asher poked the fire with a stick, the sparks rising into the night air. "Sounds like a good plan." She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You believe we make it?" He smiled faintly, his eyes still on the fire. "I've seen worse odds." For a while they said nothing more. The river whispered beside them, and the wind carried the scent of spring. They were two people shaped by loss, bound by something neither of them had planned. But under the stars there was a quiet understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The land had changed with the season, but not enough to make the journey easy. The snow that had blanketed the ground only weeks ago had melted into mud and rivers that overflowed their banks, making every mile harder than the last. The air smelled of pine sap and thawing earth, signs of life returning, even in a place that still felt half dead. Asher, Boone, and Sahoya rode side by side through the thinning forest, their horses moving slow and steady across the uneven trail. The world around them was quiet except for the rhythm of hooves against the damp ground and the creak of worn leather. They'd been traveling for days now, following the boys' directions south toward White Mesa, a stretch of land few men dared to cross. The hills there were scarred with old canyons and broken trails, the kind of country that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. But Sahoya did. She rode ahead most mornings, scanning the terrain, reading the signs of the earth the way Asher read the movement of cattle. He trusted her instincts, and she trusted his steadiness, an unspoken bond that had only grown stronger with every mile. The journey wasn't just about finding her sister, not anymore. For both of them, it had become something else entirely, a test of who they were now, after everything they had lost. The land had changed with the season, but not enough to make the journey easy. The snow that had blanketed the ground only weeks ago had melted into mud and rivers that overflowed their banks, making every mile harder than the last. The air smelled of pine sap and thawing earth, signs of life returning, even in a place that still felt half dead. Asher, Boone, and Sahoya rode side by side through the thinning forest, their horses moving slow and steady across the uneven trail. The world around them was quiet except for the rhythm of hooves against the damp ground and the creak of worn leather. They'd been traveling for days now, following the boys' directions south toward White Mesa, a stretch of land few men dared to cross. The hills there were scarred with old canyons and broken trails, the kind of country that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. But Sahoya did. She rode ahead most mornings, scanning the terrain, reading the signs of the earth the way Asher read the movement of cattle. He trusted her instincts, and she trusted his steadiness, an unspoken bond that had only grown stronger with every mile. The journey wasn't just about finding her sister, not anymore. For both of them, it had become something else entirely, a test of who they were now after everything they had lost. On the third day, the rain came. It started as a drizzle at dawn and turned into a downpour by midday. The sky went from gray to near black, and the sound of thunder rolled through the mountains like a warning. The trail became a slick mess of mud and rock, and every step forward was a battle against the elements. Asher gritted his teeth and pulled his hat lower against the rain. His coat was soaked through, his boots caked in mud. He glanced over at Sahoya, who rode with her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead. She didn't complain, didn't flinch. They found shelter that night under an overhang of stone, the rain still pounding outside as they built a small fire from the driest twigs they could find. The fire sputtered but caught, glowing weakly in the dark. Sahoya sat close to the flames, her blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. Water dripped from her hair, catching the light like shards of glass. Asher sat across from her, rubbing warmth back into his hands. "You've got grit," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Most folks would have turned back 2 days ago." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I've seen worse storms," she said softly. Then after a moment she added, "You too?" Asher chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, guess I have." For a while they sat without speaking, the fire popping softly between them. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the smell of wet earth filled the cave. In the flicker of the firelight, Sahoya's eyes looked distant, somewhere far away, somewhere that wasn't this cave. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He already knew. She was thinking of her sister. And for reasons he didn't want to admit, Asher found himself wanting her to find that peace, wanting it more than he wanted to keep his own walls standing. By the time the storm passed, the world had turned sharp and clean again. The sky was blue, the air crisp. They rode out early, their horses refreshed and restless from the long night. The trail wound through a canyon lined with red rock and patches of stubborn snow that refused to melt. The river below snaked through the valley, reflecting the morning light. It was the kind of land that could steal a man's breath, and then his life if he wasn't careful. By midday, they saw movement on the ridge above them. Asher reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes. 3 figures on horseback, maybe more, were silhouetted against the skyline. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. The way they sat their saddles, the way their horses shifted restlessly, it wasn't friendly. "Don't look," he murmured to Sahoya. "Keep riding." She didn't ask questions. She followed his lead, her posture stiffening slightly. They rode on for another mile before the ridge opened up and the figures disappeared from view. But Asher's gut told him it wasn't over. Trouble had a way of circling back, especially in places like this. That night, when they made camp, he kept the fire low and his rifle close. Sahoya said nothing, but she didn't sleep either. The silence between them was tense, filled with the kind of knowing that didn't need words. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and though Asher had heard that sound 1,000 times before, it made the back of his neck prickle. They moved faster after that, rising before dawn, breaking camp before the light touched the horizon. The land grew rougher, the trails narrower. They crossed icy streams, climbed steep ridges, and rode through forests that seemed to whisper of eyes watching from the dark. On the 5th day, they came to a river that was too deep to cross easily. The bridge, a rickety span of rotted wood, had long since fallen. The current below churned, fast and cold. Sahoya dismounted, scanning the banks. "We cross here," she said. Asher looked at her like she was crazy. "You trying to drown us both?" She smiled faintly, a rare thing these days. "Not if we move fast." They tied down their packs and guided the horses into the water. The current bit at their legs, pulling hard, but they pushed through together. Halfway across, Sahoya's horse stumbled, losing its footing. "Asher!" she cried out. He didn't think. He moved. In 2 strides, he was beside her, one arm wrapping around her waist, his other hand gripping the reins tight. The water surged around them, icy and relentless, but he pulled them both through. When they finally made it to the other side, soaked to the bone, Sahoya fell to her knees, laughing breathlessly. "You're out of your damn mind," Asher said, shaking his head, water dripping from his hat brim. "Maybe," she said between breaths, "but I'm still here." Asher couldn't help it. He laughed too. It was the first real laugh he'd had in years, deep and raw, cutting through the cold. And in that moment, something broke loose inside him. The wall he'd built around himself, the guilt he'd carried for too long. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and realized that somewhere along this trail, she'd become more than just someone he was helping. She'd become the thing that kept him going. The days passed, and the land began to shift again. The forest thinned into open plains, and the air grew warmer. They were close now, Sahoya could feel it. Each night she prayed softly by the fire, whispering her sister's name to the stars. Asher never interrupted. He just sat nearby, cleaning his rifle or watching the flames, pretending not to listen, but taking in every word. The journey had carved something out of both of them, stripped away everything unnecessary until only the truth remained. They were two souls bound by loss, by hope, by the shared burden of the trail, and as the horizon stretched before them, Asher knew this journey wasn't just about finding her sister. It was about finding themselves, finding something worth fighting for again. Asher looked over at Sahoya as she tended the fire, her face glowing in the light. "You think she's out there?" he asked quietly. Sahoya looked up, her eyes steady. "I know she is." Asher nodded slowly, staring out into the darkness beyond the camp. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faintest scent of rain and wild sage. "Then we'll find her," he said, "no matter what waits ahead." And with that, they sat in silence, side by side, the fire between them burning steady against the vast, wild night, two weary travelers chasing the same fragile hope through the heart of the frontier. The last stretch of their journey was the hardest, not because of the land. It had finally softened into open country where the grass bent easy in the wind, but because of what it meant. Hope is a heavy thing to carry when you've been living without it for so long. For weeks, Asher, Boone, and Sahoya had followed faint signs, tracks, campfire remains, scraps of woven cloth caught on brush. Each clue led them deeper into the wild, through canyons and across the plains, until finally, one dusk, they saw smoke curling from a small valley below. Sahoya reined in her horse and stared down at the campfire, her breath catching. "That's her," she whispered, her voice trembling. Asher didn't ask how she knew. He could hear it in her tone. Some truths didn't need words. They approached slowly, their horses moving carefully down the slope. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and wood smoke. A figure appeared from the shadows of a tent. A young woman, thin but standing tall, her hair braided like Sahoya's. She froze at the sight of them, her hand hovering near a knife at her hip. Then in a single heartbeat, the recognition broke through. "Nadia!" Sahoya cried, her voice raw. The younger woman's knife fell to the ground. She ran forward, her bare feet kicking up dust, and the two sisters collided in an embrace that felt like it might never end. Sahoya sobbed into her sister's shoulder, clutching her as if afraid she'd vanish again. Asher turned away, giving them the space they needed. He dismounted, tending to the horses, pretending not to hear the muffled cries behind him. But in truth, the sound stirred something deep inside him, something he'd buried for years. He thought of his own brother, Samuel, the one he couldn't save. For a long time, he'd believed reunions like this only belonged to other people, not men like him. But watching those two women, alive and whole again, he realized maybe some wounds could heal after all. The sisters insisted Asher stay the night in the small camp, and he agreed, though he didn't rest much. When dawn came, they broke camp and began the long ride back north, toward the valley where it had all begun. Weeks later, they crested the final ridge, and the sight of the ranch below took Asher's breath. It wasn't much, a patch of grassland, a few grazing cattle, a cabin and barn standing side by side. But it was theirs. For the first time, it looked like more than just a place to live. It looked like home. Asher helped Nadia down from her horse. She was still weak from months on the run, her body thin but her spirit sharp. She looked around the valley, smiling faintly. "You live here?" she asked, her English hesitant but clear. "Yeah," Asher said. "We do." She turned to her sister, something soft in her eyes. "It's good," she said. "Safe." Sahoya nodded, her gaze sweeping over the land. She hadn't realized until now how much this place had changed her, how much they had changed it. When she first arrived, it had been nothing but wood, dirt, and silence. Now there was warmth. Smoke from the chimney curled into the sky. The corral fence stood strong, and the land around it seemed to breathe again. That evening, they cooked a simple meal over the fire: beans, venison, and cornbread. Nadia laughed for the first time in a long while, the sound carrying through the valley. Sahoya sat beside her, their shoulders touching, her smile full and easy. Asher watched them from across the table, his cup of coffee warming his hands. He'd never been good at joining moments like this: family, laughter, peace. But he didn't need to speak to feel part of it. The silence that had once been heavy now felt different, comfortable, alive. When the night settled in and the fire dimmed, Sahoya turned to him. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we build more. Fences, maybe a second cabin. Nadia will stay." Asher nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Yeah, we'll build more." And in that moment, something clicked inside him. It wasn't just about fixing fences or feeding cattle anymore. It was about building something that lasted, something that mattered. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life returned, but it was a new rhythm, fuller than before. The mornings began with the smell of coffee and laughter from inside the cabin. Nadia helped Sahoya plant new crops by the stream, while Asher repaired the barn roof. Every sound that used to echo in loneliness was now filled with life. The soft clatter of dishes, the rhythmic thud of a hammer, the voices of two sisters talking in a language older than the land itself. Sometimes Asher would pause in his work, leaning against the fence post to watch them. It wasn't out of longing, it was out of quiet gratitude. For the first time since Samuel's death, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the past to catch him. He felt free. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Sahoya joined him by the corral. Her hair was loose, the wind tugging at it. She leaned against the fence beside him, watching the light fade. "You ever think," she said softly, "that we were meant to find each other?" Asher's lips twitched. "I don't know about meant to, but I'm glad we did." She smiled, eyes on the horizon. "You were alone too long," she said. "Now you not." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw in her eyes the same kind of freedom he felt inside. She hadn't been given to him, like the old ways dictated. She had chosen to stay, and somehow that made all the difference. By midsummer, the ranch had changed completely. The garden was thick with green shoots, the fences strong and straight, the fields alive with cattle. Nadia had built a small shelter near the stream, her laughter a constant melody around the place. And every evening, when the day's work was done, Asher, Sahoya, and Nadia would sit together by the porch as the sky turned gold and pink, watching the land settle into night. The valley, once quiet and cold, was alive again. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut hay, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the space where loneliness used to live. Asher often found himself thinking about freedom, what it really meant. He'd spent years believing it was solitude, distance, and silence. But now, watching the two women beside him, he understood something deeper. Freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about having the right to choose who stood beside you. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring: hard seasons, storms, maybe even loss again. But for the first time, the thought didn't scare him. He'd faced the worst the world could offer and still found his way home. As the last light of sunset faded from the valley, Sahoya leaned her head against his shoulder. "We live here now," she whispered. "Together?" Asher nodded, his arm resting lightly around her. "Yeah," he said softly. "Together." The wind moved through the grass that night, soft and warm. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, casting golden light over the walls. The three of them sat quietly, the peace between them unbroken, the weight of their past finally at rest. For Asher Boone, the man who once believed the world had nothing left to offer, it turned out that life had been waiting all along, waiting for him to stop running, to turn and face it, and to build something real. And for Sahoya, the woman who had once been given away as payment for a debt, she had found something greater than freedom. She had found choice. They lived together, not out of obligation, not out of survival, but out of love, trust, and the kind of quiet peace that only comes after a storm. And that, more than anything, was true freedom. The sun over Dry Creek burned like fire that day, melting the horizon into a haze of gold and dust. The wind came hard off the mesa, carrying the bitter taste of iron and dry sage. Every breath felt like swallowing heat. Abel Harkin reined in his tired bay horse near the old supply station. His wagon creaked, loaded with sacks of feed and a half-empty barrel of water. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, but he didn't mind. Heat, dust, and silence had long been part of his life, ever since the day the fever took his wife and left him with an empty ranch and too many acres of quiet. The place looked half dead, the way most things did out here. The wood of the porch was sun-bleached, the windows covered in a film of grit. But there, beneath the warped roof of the station, someone sat, a lone figure wrapped in a faded shawl, still as a rock. At first, Abel thought she might be asleep. Then she lifted her head and he saw her eyes. They were black as obsidian and just as cold. The woman's skin was brown and sunburnt, her face proud but tired, her hair tangled by the wind. Next to her feet sat a small canvas bag, her whole life tied up in one worn piece of cloth. The station master, an old man with tobacco stains on his beard, leaned toward Abel. "Found her sitting there when the wagon from Fort Stanton rolled through," he muttered. "The missionaries dumped her. Said she wasn't welcome no more." "Why?" Abel asked quietly. "Guess they finally remembered she's Apache," the man said, spitting into the dust. "Figured she don't belong with them." Abel turned back to her. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch under his gaze. She looked past him, past the road, toward the desert that shimmered like glass. He recognized that look, the hollow kind people wear when they've lost too much to fear anything else. He'd worn it himself once. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A tumbleweed rolled between them, catching on her shawl before the wind dragged it away. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled behind the hills. Abel wiped the sweat from his brow. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. No answer. Her eyes shifted to him, sharp, uncertain, measuring. She was used to being hunted, not helped. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. "I've got a roof," he said. "Some land. Water that still runs most days. If you need a place, you can come with me." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. The wind picked up again, lifting strands of her dark hair across her face. For a heartbeat, she looked almost like part of the desert itself. Strong, scarred, beautiful in a way that comes only from surviving. The station master snorted. "You sure you want to bring her back, Harkin? Folks'll talk." Abel didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on her. Finally, the woman nodded once. Small, cautious, but sure. A silent agreement between two people the world had already forgotten. Abel tipped his hat, motioning toward the wagon. "Then let's go," he said simply. As she rose, the sun caught the dust at her feet, swirling around them in a circle of red light. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, under a sky big enough to swallow them both, a cowboy and an outcast woman took the first step towards something neither of them had expected, a second chance. The road back to Dry Creek Ranch was nothing but silence and wind. The wagon wheels moaned over the packed dirt, carving the same ruts Abel had followed for years. The sun had dipped low, staining the mesas in rust and shadow. Nita sat in the back, her hands folded over the small canvas bag she carried like armor. She didn't ask where they were going. Abel didn't ask where she'd been. The desert filled the space between them, the only voice either of them trusted. When the ranch finally came into view, it looked smaller than he remembered. Just a tired stretch of fence, a crooked barn, and a house that leaned into the wind like it had given up long ago. The place was quiet, too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped bothering with it. Abel pulled the reins and the wagon creaked to a halt. "Ain't much," he muttered, "but it's what's left." He climbed down, untied the horse, and pointed toward the well. "Water's good. Pull slow. The rope fray's easy. House leaks some on the north wall. Barn's half gone, but there's space inside if you need to lay down." Nita didn't answer. She moved like someone who had learned to keep her distance, each step careful, watching him from the corner of her eye. When she knelt to scoop water from the bucket, the last light caught her face, and for a moment Abel saw how young she really was, beneath the dust and the hard edges. He turned away, suddenly uncomfortable with the thought. That night she slept in the hayloft of the old barn. Abel brought her a thick wool blanket and left it by the door. Gets cold after dark, he said. She nodded once, not meeting his eyes. Inside the house, he sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning. The flame flickered against the warped wood, throwing long, lonely shadows. His supper sat untouched. From outside came the sound of the wind pushing against the barn boards, whistling through the cracks like some restless ghost. He leaned back, rubbed his jaw, and let the question come. Had he brought trouble home? Or had he just done something right for the first time in years? He didn't know which scared him more. The wind howled again, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Abel took one last look toward the barn, then blew out the lamp. At dawn, the smell of smoke and coffee woke him. He stepped outside, boots crunching frost, and stopped short. Nita was crouched by the fire pit, feeding it with kindling. She had the kettle on, her shawl pulled tight, her hair catching the faint gold of morning light. She didn't look up when he came near, just poured a tin cup and set it beside him on a flat rock. Steam rose between them. Abel hesitated, then took it. "Thanks," he said quietly. Nita gave a small nod, eyes still on the fire. Neither of them smiled. Neither needed to. In that pale morning light, with nothing but wind and coffee between them, two strangers shared something neither had felt in a long, long time. Peace that didn't need words. Out here, that was how trust began. By the time word spread through Dry Creek, it was already too late to stop the talking. Every porch, every bar counter, every Sunday pew had the same whisper. That rancher, Abel Harkin, took in an Apache woman. And when the story grew legs, it ran even faster. He's marrying her. Abel heard the gossip long before it reached his door. Folks didn't mean harm, but out here, difference had a way of making people uneasy. A man could mend a fence with his neighbor one day and still cross the street to avoid him the next if he broke from what was expected. But Abel had made up his mind. The marriage wasn't about love, not the kind the preacher spoke of. It was about two people standing at the edge of a hard world, trying to build something steady before the wind blew them away. He rode into town that evening, dust settling on his hat brim, and tied his horse outside the old chapel. The building leaned like it was tired of praying for people who never listened. Inside, the pews smelled of dry wood and candle smoke. Reverend Miles, a thin man with hands like twigs, looked up from a Bible missing half its pages. Abel didn't bother with small talk. "Reverend," he said, "I need you to marry us." The old man blinked. "You and the Apache woman?" "That's right," Miles sighed, glancing toward the window where the sunset burned red over the hills. "Folks won't take kindly to it." Abel met his gaze. "Folks don't feed me. They don't fix my fences either." There was no anger in his tone, just the flat certainty of a man too tired to ask for approval. After a long pause, the Reverend nodded. "Tomorrow evening, then. Bring her." When the time came, the sky was painted in fire, orange, gold, and violet streaks bleeding into the horizon. Nita wore a plain cotton dress someone from town had left on the porch weeks ago. Her hair was loose, her face calm but unreadable. Abel wore the same shirt he worked in, freshly washed and stiff with soap. No guests came. Only the Reverend and his wife stood as witnesses. The wind carried the smell of mesquite and the hum of distant crickets. As the Reverend read the vows, Abel's mind wandered, not to the words but to the stillness around them. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel empty. "Do you take this woman?" "I do," Abel said before the question even finished. The Reverend turned to Nita. "And do you take this man?" She didn't speak. Instead, she lifted her gaze to Abel's, steady, dark, unflinching. There was no fear there, no surrender, only something deeper, a quiet, cautious faith. She gave a single nod. The Reverend closed the book. "Then by God's will, it's done." The wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the dry churchyard, lifting dust into a halo around them. Nita's shawl fluttered like a bird trying to remember how to fly. Abel looked at her and saw not the strangeness others saw, but the calm of someone who had already walked through hell and come out still standing. He reached for her hand, rough, calloused, warm. "Guess we're family now," he said softly. She didn't answer, just met his eyes in silence. And in that moment, under the dying light of the desert sun, Abel saw something he hadn't seen since the day his wife was buried. a reason to believe again. The Harkin Ranch sat quiet beneath the hard blue sky. Too quiet. Wind scraped over the land like sandpaper, dragging dust through the dead grass. The well had dropped to a thin trickle, the fences leaned, and the cattle, thin and hollow-flanked, moved slow, their ribs showing beneath sunburnt hides. It was the kind of silence that swallowed men whole if they stayed long enough. Abel had learned to live with it. He had talked to the wind more than he had to people these last few years. But now there was another sound, the soft shuffle of bare feet on dry earth, the scrape of a broom across the porch, the faint thud of wood against the wall. Nita. She worked without asking, without speaking. At sunrise, she was already outside hauling water from the well, washing dust from the window panes, sweeping out the barn. Her small frame moved through the ruins of his ranch like someone trying to coax life out of something already given up for dead. Abel watched from the corral, one hand resting on the rail. He didn't understand it. Why she bothered. She didn't owe him anything. Yet there she was, mending what years of grief and wind had broken. Inside the cabin, the smell of smoke drifted through the doorway for the first time in months. Nita stood at the stove, stirring a pot hung over a low flame. The light from the fire caught in her hair, and the room, once gray and still, looked almost alive again. Abel came in quietly, removing his hat. He had almost forgotten what supper looked like. On the table sat beans, cornbread, and a small tin of coffee. Simple food, but warm, real. He sat down. Nita didn't join him. She moved to the corner, fixing a tear in one of his shirts. Abel took a bite, then another. The beans were smoky, rich with a taste that pulled something loose inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just filling his stomach. He was eating like a man who lived. He looked toward her. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Nita's hands didn't stop sewing. "The house was sick," she said softly. "Now it breathes again." Her words caught him off guard. He wanted to answer, to say thank you, but the words wouldn't come. Gratitude felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Outside, dusk crept in. Coyotes howled somewhere past the ridge. Abel stepped onto the porch, the smell of wood smoke clinging to his shirt. From the barn came a faint sound, soft, almost like wind at first, then clearly a voice. Nita was singing. The melody rose and fell in the Apache tongue, low and haunting. It carried across the yard, across the tired fences and the thirsty fields. Abel stood still, hand over his chest as if afraid to breathe. He didn't know the words, but he felt them. The song sounded like the earth remembering rain, or like a prayer whispered for the dead. For a moment he thought of Mary, his wife, her laughter, the smell of lilacs that used to hang by the window. He imagined her standing there in the doorway, smiling faintly, nodding toward Nita as if to say, "It's all right now." When the song ended, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was different, softer. Abel turned back toward the house, the lamplight glowing through the cracks in the shutters. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a ghost wandering his own land. He felt like a man standing in a home again. The days grew longer, and the wind over Dry Creek lost a bit of its bite. The fields were still cracked and dry, but there was movement now, laughter where there had only been silence. It started with one child. A boy of about 7 wandered up the road one morning, bare feet white with dust, clutching a broken slate board under his arm. His mother worked laundry in town. His father, a ranch hand, drank more than he earned. He'd heard the rumor. The Apache woman on Harkin's ranch was teaching children to read. At first, Abel thought it was nonsense. But one afternoon when he came back from the north pasture, he saw them, half a dozen of them, thin kids with sunburnt cheeks and patched clothes, sitting cross-legged in the shadow of the old storage shed. The door had been torn off years ago, and sunlight streamed through the cracks in the roof, painting stripes across the dirt floor. Nita stood at the front, chalking letters on a piece of board propped against a barrel. Her voice carried soft but clear, rising and falling with the rhythm of a lullaby. "B-I-L-L," she said, then pointed. "Say it with me." A chorus of tiny voices repeated after her, rough but eager. "Ball." Abel leaned against the fence post and watched. The sight of it pulled at something deep in him. Later, when the lesson ended, one little girl stayed behind. She was pale-skinned but had her mother's dark eyes. She looked up at Nita and asked, "Miss Nita, what does the word home mean?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the heat. Nita smiled, tired but gentle. "It means," she said slowly, "the place where you stop running." The child tilted her head, thinking about it, then nodded. That night, Abel couldn't get the words out of his mind. The place where you stop running. Maybe that's what he'd been doing all this time. Running from ghosts, from grief, from himself. In the following weeks, the school grew. Women from the edge of town began sending their children, even a few of the white settlers who'd once muttered about that Indian woman. They came first out of curiosity, then out of gratitude. Some days, Nita taught them words. Other days, she taught them songs. On Sundays, she taught them how to plant beans in the dusty ground and told them stories about the land, the way her people once read the stars and listened to the river's voice. She never preached. She simply showed them that learning was its own kind of faith. Abel often found himself standing outside the shed's doorway, hat in hand, watching the light spill across her hair as she moved among the children. The sun turned her dark braids to bronze, her laughter soft and low like wind through tall grass. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. One afternoon, as the kids ran home, Nita stayed behind to clean up. Abel walked up and placed a new bucket of chalk and paper beside her. "Thought you might use these," he said. Nita looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you." He hesitated. "You're doing something good here." Her eyes met his, steady, warm, unguarded. "So are you," she said. For the first time in years, Abel felt the air shift inside him. The sun was setting, the sky glowing red against the mountains, and for the briefest second, he could almost swear he smelled lilacs again. Mary's flowers. But this wasn't the past coming back. It was something new growing in its place, and it was alive. The wind came first, low, moaning, the kind that carried warnings in its breath, the kind every rancher knew by heart. Abel stepped out onto the porch, looked toward the horizon, and saw the sky turning the color of gunmetal. Clouds rolled over the ridge like smoke from a wildfire. He could feel it before it hit, the electric sting in the air, the uneasy silence before the storm breaks. Even the cattle had gone still, heads low, tails twitching. The desert held its breath. By the time the first crack of thunder hit, the rain was already cutting sideways, hard as gravel. Abel shouted for Nita, his voice torn away by the wind. "Get inside!" He ran for the corral, lightning tearing across the sky. The ground shook as a bolt struck the north fence, splintering the post and setting dry brush ablaze. In an instant, the herd panicked. They broke the rail and scattered into the dark, hooves pounding like drums. Abel swung open the gate, grabbed his lasso, and ran for the stable. But Nita wasn't there. Her saddle was gone. Fear struck him harder than the rain. He stumbled into the open, blinking through the downpour. Then he saw her, far out in the pasture, a flash of movement between lightning bolts. Nita was on horseback, her figure outlined against the storm. The animal reared, hooves cutting the air, but she held steady, shouting something he couldn't understand. Short, sharp words in Apache that cut through the wind. She cracked her whip, her voice fierce and wild as the thunder itself. "Hey-ya! Oh nah! Turn them!" The cattle shifted, turning from the slopes, following her lead. Abel watched, frozen for a heartbeat, then grabbed his own horse and rode out. Rain stung his face. Mud clung to his boots, but he caught up beside her as she drove the herd back toward the lower field. Lightning flashed again, bright enough to paint her face. Eyes blazing, jaw set, soaked to the bone. She looked like something out of an old story, half spirit, half woman, commanding the chaos. They worked side by side in the storm, shouting above the roar. When the last steer stumbled through the gate, Abel slammed it shut and leaned against the rail, chest heaving. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain had softened to a whisper, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Abel turned toward her. Nita slid off her horse, her hair plastered against her face, clothes clinging to her like a second skin. She wiped rain from her brow, breathing hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too small for what he'd just seen. Finally, he managed, "You don't need anyone to save you." Her dark eyes met his, glinting in the afterlight. "No," she said softly, "I don't." Abel's lips twitched into something close to a smile. "But you just might have saved me." For a long moment they stood there drenched and breathless, the storm retreating into the distance. The wind died and the land exhaled, a long, quiet sigh of relief. Abel looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't the woman he'd brought home from that station anymore. She was the land itself, wild, unbroken, alive. And for the first time in years, Abel Harkin realized he wasn't fighting the world alone. The storm passed, but the air still smelled of rain and iron. For days after, the land stayed quiet, like it too was catching its breath. The cattle grazed close to the barn now, and Abel fixed the broken fences with new posts. Nita helped, her hands raw and steady, saying little but doing much. Between them, silence had changed. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. One afternoon, a rider came down the dirt road from town, a mailbag slung over his shoulder. He waved as he approached the porch. "Letter for you, Harkin. Came from the mission up in Fort Stanton." Abel took the envelope, thick with dust and the smell of travel. "Who's it from?" The rider shrugged. "Don't say. Just the church seal." After he rode off, Abel turned the envelope in his hands. The handwriting was old-fashioned, uneven. He called for Nita. She came from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes questioning. Abel hesitated before handing it to her. "It's addressed to you." She froze. It had been years since anyone had written her name. Slowly, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged by time and rain. She began to read aloud, soft at first, then quieter still. "To the woman once left behind at Dry Creek Station. If this reaches you, I pray it brings peace. I am Reverend Samuel Croft, the man who served with the missionaries at Fort Stanton. I am dying now, and in the last of my days I cannot leave this world without confessing what I have carried. I judged you. I called you unworthy to walk among God's chosen. I forgot that God made no mistake when He made you. I owe you an apology I cannot deliver in person. May He grant you the mercy I failed to give." The words blurred before her eyes. For a long time, Nita didn't move. The only sound was the creak of the porch boards under Abel's boots. He waited, unsure whether to speak. Finally, she set the letter down on her lap, staring at the handwriting as though it might vanish if she blinked. Tears welled slowly, not sharp or bitter, just quiet, the kind that come when something too heavy finally sets itself down. Abel stepped closer. "You knew him?" She nodded. "He was the one who turned me away. Said my blood made me unfit to teach the Lord's word." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, but there was no anger, only release. Abel knelt beside her chair. His rough hands covered hers, the paper crinkling beneath their palms. "He's wrong about that," he said gently. "You've taught more truth here than any preacher I ever met." Nita let out a shaky breath. The wind stirred, lifting the edge of the letter, fluttering it like a white flag against the afternoon sun. She looked up, eyes shining. "It's strange," she whispered. "All these years, I thought I wanted him to pay. But now, I just feel free." Abel squeezed her hand. "Then that's enough." For a moment they sat like that, listening to the wind rustle through the mesquite trees, the distant sound of a bell from her little schoolhouse ringing through the open land. Abel glanced toward the hills where the storm clouds had once gathered. "You don't have to go anywhere now, Nita," he said quietly. "You're home." She turned to him and for the first time smiled without hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." And somewhere out in the fields, the last puddles from the storm shimmered in the sun, small mirrors reflecting a sky finally clear. Winter crept over Dry Creek, slow and quiet, wrapping the hills in pale frost. The air turned thin, the mornings colder. Smoke curled from the chimney again, thin gray ribbons against the endless blue. Inside the cabin, Nita sat near the hearth, needle and thread in hand. The firelight flickered over her face as she worked, her fingers moving with patient rhythm. Across her lap lay pieces of fabric, odd scraps collected from the years that had shaped their lives. One was an old square of Abel's saddle leather, soft and worn, still smelling faintly of horse and dust. Another was a strip from her faded ceremonial shawl, embroidered long ago with Apache symbols for rain and endurance. And then there was a third, a torn piece of white cloth she had once worn in the mission, the edge still marked by faint traces of blue stitching, the color of faith long tested. Nita stitched them together, slow and deliberate, each pass of the needle like breathing, steady, intentional. Abel watched from the corner of the room, pretending to mend a broken harness. He'd been doing that for an hour now, but the truth was, he hadn't fixed a thing. His eyes kept drifting toward her, toward the firelight gleaming in her hair, the quiet grace in her hands. "What are you making?" he finally asked. "A blanket," she said without looking up. "But not just to keep warm." He smiled faintly. "What else for then?" Nita tied off a thread and held the patchwork up to the light. "For remembering," she said. "This piece was yours," she pointed to the brown leather, "and this one was mine." Her hand moved to the white cloth. "This one, that belonged to who I used to be." Abel nodded, the lines on his face deepening. He walked over, crouched beside her, and let his fingers brush over the seams. The textures met, rough leather, soft cotton, smooth hide, all stitched tight by her hand. "Feels strong," he murmured. "It is," she said, "because it's made of what survived." Abel leaned back on his heels. His eyes softened, voice low. "A blanket's a lot like a ranch," he said. "Holds together better when it's patched from different pieces." Nita's lips curved into a small smile. "And people too." For a while, neither spoke. The fire popped softly, casting orange light across the walls. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, whispering across the empty fields. Abel thought about all the things that had broken before. Fences, promises, people. How easy it was for a life to come apart. Yet somehow this woman, this quiet, stubborn, extraordinary woman, had taken all the scraps the world left her and made something whole again. When she spread the quilt across their bed that night, it glowed in the lamplight. Patches of brown and white, soft and strong, stitched by two lives that had once been strangers. Abel sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over it. "You know," he said slowly, "it's not much to look at from afar. But up close, it tells a story." Nita pulled the corner of the blanket over his shoulders and looked at him with eyes that held the warmth of the desert after rain. "Then it's just like us," she said. Abel chuckled under his breath. "Guess it is." They lay back beneath it, the fire crackling low, the air outside crisp and cold. The quilt covered them, two worlds joined by thread and forgiveness. And for the first time, Abel didn't dream of what he'd lost. He dreamed of what they were still building. By late December, the desert turned white. Snow lay heavy on the sagebrush, and the wind sliced down from the mountains like a blade. The world had gone still, too still. Even the cattle huddled close to the barn, breath rising in clouds against the dawn. Abel knew that silence. It was the kind that came before trouble. The first howl drifted across the hills that night, low, drawn out, mournful. Then another answered. Soon the sound of wolves filled the air, echoing through the canyons, closer than before. Abel set his coffee down, listening. He could picture them out there, gray shadows circling beyond the fence line, hungry eyes glinting in the dark. "They'll come for the herd," he muttered. He reached for his rifle. From the corner of the room, Nita straightened from where she'd been mending clothes. "You can't take them alone." Abel shook his head, pulling on his coat. "I've handled worse." She didn't move. "You've handled being alone. That's not the same thing." Before he could argue, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and followed him out into the storm. The cold hit like a slap. The wind howled, carrying snow sideways. They moved through it together, two dark figures against the white. Abel led with the lantern, the beam flickering over the fence posts half buried in drifts. Then came the growl. Low, close. Out of the dark, a wolf lunged. Abel fired once, the crack of the rifle echoing off the hills. The beast dropped, snow exploding around it. But there were more, shapes weaving between the shadows, eyes gleaming, teeth flashing. Nita grabbed a burning brand from the nearby woodpile and swung it wide, the fire spitting sparks into the wind. She shouted something in Apache, sharp, fierce syllables that seemed to split the night itself. The wolves hesitated, startled by her voice, by her courage. Abel moved beside her, firing again and again, until the echoes rolled into the distance and the snow began to settle. The remaining wolves turned and vanished into the trees, swallowed by the storm. When the last sound faded, Abel stood panting, rifle still raised. His breath came out in clouds. The fence was splintered, but the cattle still stood, trembling but safe. He turned to Nita. She was kneeling by the fire she'd made, feeding it dry brush, her face lit gold against the dark. The glow shimmered across her cheeks, her eyes bright and alive. He crouched beside her. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm had passed, leaving only the pop of the flames and the hiss of melting snow. Finally, Abel said quietly, "You're no one's burden, Nita. You're no man's pity." She looked up at him, her lips parting just enough for a smile. "You're my equal," he added. Then after a pause, his voice softened even more. "My partner." Pity? The word hung in the cold air like something sacred. Simple, but true. Nita reached out, placing her gloved hand over his. "Then we'll keep this land together," she said. The sun rose slow behind the ridge, washing the snow in gold. The wolves were gone, but their howls still lingered in the wind, a reminder of what they'd faced and what they'd survived. Abel looked toward the horizon, then back to her. "Partner," he repeated, testing the word like a prayer. It felt right. Spring came slow to Dry Creek, like a promise the earth had almost forgotten how to keep. The frost melted first in the hollows where the cattle drank, then along the fence line where sunlight reached the ground by noon. The world smelled of wet soil and cedar again. Out by the porch, Nita knelt in the dirt, pressing tiny seeds into the thawed earth. Her fingers were rough, the nails rimmed with soil, but she handled each seed with the tenderness of prayer. Abel stood a few yards away, leaning on his shovel, watching. "What are those?" he asked. "Morning glories," she said. "They'll climb the post if you let them." Abel frowned slightly. "Mary used to plant those." Nita paused, meeting his gaze. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her cheek. "I know," she said softly. "I found the seeds in that old tin on the shelf." He nodded, quiet. He remembered how his late wife's flowers used to bloom wild along the porch rail, blue as the sky after rain. After she passed, he'd let them die. Couldn't bear to see something that still knew how to grow. Now as Nita worked, the ground seemed to remember her touch. By mid-March, vines began to curl up the posts, green and stubborn, and when the first blossoms came, they burst open like pieces of the morning sky. One evening, Abel sat on the steps while Nita watered the flowers. The sun was setting low behind the hills, painting everything gold. The scent of the blossoms drifted on the warm wind, faint and sweet. He watched her for a long time before speaking. "I used to think that garden died with her," he said quietly. "But maybe—" He stopped, voice thick, then finished. "Maybe it was just waiting for you." Nita didn't answer at first. She set the tin can down, then sat beside him. The light caught the blue in her eyes, deep as twilight. "Maybe it was waiting for both of us," she said, "for the house to have laughter again." A gentle breeze swept through the porch, making the vines sway. The sky stretched endless above them, the kind of sky only the West could make, wide, forgiving, infinite. From the distance came the faint ringing of the school bell, the one Nita had hung beside the old shed where the children learned. Its echo drifted across the prairie, a sound soft as hope. Abel reached over, his hand finding hers. "You've changed this place," he said. "You've changed me." She smiled, small and knowing. "No," she whispered. "You just remembered how to live." They sat like that until the stars began to rise. Two souls that had once been broken, now mended in the quiet rhythm of the desert. If someone had looked from afar, they would have seen a small house standing alone in an ocean of grass, smoke curling from its chimney, morning glories wrapping the porch posts, and two figures sitting side by side as the sky bled from gold to indigo. The camera of the heart would pull back slowly, the little school bell still ringing in the wind, the fields bathed in the soft blue of dusk, the flowers swaying like waves under the endless western sky. And there, beneath it all, the sound of peace. Two lives no longer running, finally home.